The twilight of Rome did not come with a cataclysm. No, it drifted down like the final hush of a long evening, gentle and inexorable. The once mighty voice of empire, which had thundered across continents, now whispered in fading corridors. On a quiet September day in the year 476, an unremarkable date by the reckoning of Staza, shadow passed over the western heart of the Roman world. In the city of Ravenna, ringed with marshes and murmuring pine forests, the imperial palace stood silent. Its marble arches had heard the speeches of emperors and the secrets of schemers, and on this day they bore witness to something softer, more final, the changing of the guard, not through blood, but through surrender. Odoacer, a Germanic commander once in service to Rome, entered those vaulted halls, not as a conqueror, but as a conclusion. There, seated amidst relics of authority, too grand for his slender shoulders, was Romulus Augustulus, the last emperor in the West, just a boy, a child, swaddled in the costume of Caesar, barely 16, with no armies, no allies, and no real power. History would not remember him with grandeur. Even his name Romulus, the founder of Rome, and Augustus, its first true emperor, would seem a cruel joke, a final echo. But Odoacer did not strike him down. There was no final battle, no defiant speech, no crumbling of stone. The gesture was quiet, almost reverent. He took the imperial vestments, the crimson cloak, the diadem glittering with worn gemstones. The scepter passed from hand to hand like a fading torch and placed them gently in a chest. Then he sent that chest eastward, across mountains and seas, to Constantinople, along with a message. There would be no more emperors in the West. The line, unbroken for centuries, would end with a whisper. Romulus was not slain or paraded. He was pensioned off, given a villa in Campania, where olive trees rustled and time moved slow. There, far from the stage of history, he faded into legend, a boy who wore the mask of empire as it crumbled in his hands. But what died that day was not merely a boy's brief reign or a city's illusion of permanence. It was the breath of the classical world itself, the last sigh of an ancient age. The West did not explode, it unraveled, not in a moment, but across centuries, thread by thread, idea by idea. To say that Rome fell is too simple, too sudden. The truth is more complicated, more human, like the slow withering of a great oak, its roots eaten away over generations, while its trunk still stood tall. By the time 476 arrived, the Rome of Augustus was already gone, ghostly and distant. The marble had cracked, the statues had eroded, the empire had become rural, religious, and fractured. Its armies no longer Roman in blood, but foreign. Its cities, once vibrant with forums and libraries, had shrunk to shadows. Its economy revolved not around trade, but toil farming, taxes, and survival. And yet, those who inherited it, the so-called barbarians, did not see themselves as destroyers. They were not savage intruders come to dismantle civilization. They were men of war and ambition, yes, but also men of vision. They had served in Roman legions. Their children spoke Latin. Their courts mimicked Roman law. They wore Roman robes and read Roman scrolls. They did not wish to erase the empire. They wished to possess it, to inhabit its legacy like a second skin. They were not burning Rome down, they were attempting, in their own way, to become Rome. But something irretrievable had indeed been lost: unity. The dream of a single empire, one law, one ruler from Britain to Babylon, was now dust. The West fractured into kingdoms, each one a fragment, a broken mirror reflecting only part of the whole. The old Rome was gone. What remained was its memory. In Spain and southern Gaul, the Visigoths reigned, seated in cities that still bore Roman names. In North Africa, the Vandals had taken Carthage, once the bitter enemy of Rome, now its strange inheritor. And in Italy itself, the Ostrogoths emerged under the command of Theodoric, the greater man who might have been carved from two worlds. Theodoric had grown up in Constantinople, not as a guest, but as a hostage, political pawn in the great chessboard of empires. There, he absorbed Roman customs, admired Roman architecture, dined among scholars and priests. Yet he remained Gothic by blood and blade. He could sign his name with a stencil of gold, though he may not have understood the words beneath his own signature. A king shaped by paradox. When he came to power, Italy did not collapse. In fact, under Theodoric, it glimmered briefly with a borrowed light. Aqueducts were repaired, markets opened, laws were written and enforced. The Senate, that ancient body of statesmen, still convened, more ceremonial than potent. To systems of law coexisted Roman codes for Roman citizens, Gothic customs for Gothic warriors. It was not equality, but it was order. A strange coexistence, a living experiment in hybridity. But this patchwork of peace could not halt the deeper tides of change. The cities, the beating heart of Roman life, continued to fade. Their fountains stilled, their forums emptied, their libraries closed. With long-distance trade decaying and state patronage gone, people abandoned urban life for the countryside. Rome, that eternal city, once home to 1,000,000 souls, had become a hushed ruin, perhaps housing 50,000 by the dawn of the 6th century. The empire was not only retreating militarily, was receding from the imagination. Yet from this vacuum, new power emerged. Not from palaces, but from pulpits. Not emperors, but bishops. Christianity, once a persecuted faith, had become the spine of the West. Since Constantine's fateful conversion, the Church had grown, absorbed, and adapted. And now, with emperors vanishing and governors fleeing, the bishops stepped forward. They did not just preach, they governed. They distributed grain, settled disputes, wrote letters to kings and warlords, and above all, they preserved. In 452, the Bishop of Rome, Pope Leo the Great, walked out to meet a tempest in human form. Attila the Hun, with no army at his back. Leo spoke words laced with faith and fearlessness, and against all odds, the scourge of God turned away. No miracle of sword, just the miracle of persuasion. In that moment, the Church proved its might. It would henceforth not only guide souls, but shield cities. This growing authority crystallized under Pope Gregory the Great. From 590 to 604, he ruled not merely as pontiff, but as Rome's de facto sovereign. He repaired walls, marshaled militias, negotiated with barbarians. But his gaze reached further. Gregory imagined not a return to Roman dominance, but a rebirth of spiritual dominion. He envisioned a new Rome, not one built of stone and legions, but one of faith and monks. In 597, he sent Augustine his emissary, not the famed theologian, to distant England. There, among pagan chieftains and misty woods, the seeds of a Christian Europe were sown. Gregory's Rome was not the Rome of Caesar. It was something gentler, deeper, a city of saints rather than senators. Meanwhile, far to the east, Constantinople still gleamed. The Eastern Roman Empire, what we now call Byzantium, watched the West's transformation with both disdain and determination. To Emperor Justinian, the kingdoms of the West were not heirs, they were thieves, and he would reclaim what was stolen. In 533, he unleashed his general, Belisarius, commander of brilliance and restraint. First, they toppled the Vandals in North Africa, restoring imperial control to the storied shores of Carthage. Then they turned to Italy. Thus began the Gothic War's 2 decades of devastation. What followed was not liberation, but ruination. The cities burned, the fields were salted, the population may have halved. When the dust settled, Rome was technically Roman again, but the cost had been dear. The Ostrogothic kingdom, with its fragile balance, was gone. In its place stood a distant bureaucracy, exhausted and overstretched. In his quest to revive empire, Justinian had unwittingly finished its undoing. Theodoric's delicate harmony was shattered, and as the imperial banners fluttered limply over broken walls, new invaders approached. The Lombards, another wave of northern migrants, carving out their own foothold in the already fractured landscape. By the close of the 6th century, Western Europe had become something unrecognizable to any old Roman. Trade was local. Cities were bunkers. Latin persisted, but twisted into new tongues. The rule of law faded into customs and clan loyalties. What was left of classical civilization huddled in monasteries, whispered in prayers, copied onto fragile parchment. But this was not an end. It was a chrysalis. In Ireland, monks labored in cold scriptoria, preserving Virgil and Cicero beneath Celtic roofs. In the Frankish courts, chieftains began to see themselves not as raiders, but as rulers absorbing fragments of Roman governance, Christian ethics, and tribal tradition. It was not decline, it was metamorphosis. The empire had not been destroyed, it had been transformed, its soul reincarnated into 1,000 forms, kingdoms and cathedrals, customs and creeds. And from this mosaic, something new would emerge. A medieval Europe, armored not just in steel, but in memory. A world built not atop the ruins of Rome, but within them. A world that would someday remember the fall, not with despair, but as the prelude to rebirth. In the glow of forge fires and the quietude of monastic cloisters, the world began to change not with thunderclaps or broken walls, but with needle and thread, brushstroke and prayer. The classical age, whose last breaths faded with the fall of Rome, was not replaced overnight. It lingered like perfume in old halls, as artisans of the so-called barbarian kingdoms began to experiment with forms that were both alien and familiar. In the dim workshops of Merovingian Gaul or the hilltop halls of Visigothic Spain, craftsmen trained by memory, not manuscript, took the columns and scrollwork of Rome and blended them with the intricate patterns of their own heritage spirals, knots, beasts entwined in endless loops. A new art was forming, one born not of decline, but of synthesis. These were not mere imitators of Rome. They were the first Europeans, and as the brush met vellum and the chisel kissed stone, so too were deeper transformations underway. The landscape of Europe, once crisscrossed with Roman roads and bound together by imperial decree, had become a patchwork, some pieces bright with new possibility, others faded and frayed. Local chieftains and warlords, bishops and abbots, dukes and council, carved their domains from the remnants of empire. Spiritual authority was growing bolder, no longer confined to the catacombs or whispered gospels. The bishops of Rome spoke now with the voice of kings. Popes negotiated with armies. Monks copied not just scripture, but science, history, and poetry. In their calloused hands, civilization did not die, was cradled. In this twilight of empires and dawn of kingdoms, the very shape of Europe began to form. Not Roman, not barbarian, but something other, something new. A place where sacred and secular would contend and conspire, where the cross would rival the crown, where the village mattered more than the city, and the oaths sworn before God held more weight than imperial decrees. Unity was still a dream, distant and drowsy, but the dream persisted. Even as kingdoms rose and fell like breaths on a sleeping continent, and then came a wind from the south. It came not as a whisper, but as a roar, a tide rolling across desert and mountain, bearing a faith born in Arabia and a banner that read, "There is no God but God." The Umayyad Caliphate had transformed the Mediterranean. From the gates of India to the coast of Spain, Islam spread not only as a religion, but as a civilization brilliant, ordered, and powerful. In Damascus, scholars read Plato in Arabic. In Cairo, astronomers mapped the heavens. In Kairouan, poets wrote verses as delicate as any in Rome. By the early 8th century, Muslim forces had swept through North Africa, crossed the Strait of Gibraltar, and conquered nearly all of Iberia. They climbed the Pyrenees, confident and swift, until they reached the fertile lands of Gaul. It was here, in the wooded heart of Frankish territory, near the town of Tours, that the two worlds met. It is said that in October of the year 732, Charles called Martel. The hammer stood with his Frankish warriors, facing the banners of Abdal-Rahman al-Ghafiqi, governor of Al-Andalus, and commander of the Caliph's army. This was no mere border skirmish. This was a hinge in the history of Europe. Charles was not a king, not yet. But he was the true ruler of the Franks. His authority came not from crown or inheritance, but from victory. He had beaten back rivals, forged alliances, and built an army disciplined like the Romans, but rooted in Frankish might. The Muslim army was vast, agile, mounted. Their cavalry had galloped across continents, bearing curved swords and a tradition of conquest that rivaled Rome itself. But the Franks stood firm, shoulder to shoulder, heavy with mail and shield, armed with the Franciscata throwing axe, from which their name came. When the battle began, it was a contest not just of weapons, but of worlds. Arab light cavalry darted and circled. Frankish infantry braced and pushed. The two sides clashed under a sky gray, with smoke and prophecy. And then, as dusk fell, a cry rose from the Muslim ranks. Abdal-Rahman had fallen. In the night, the invaders retreated. The hammer had held. The Battle of Tours would become legend. Some would say it saved Christian Europe. Others would claim the Muslim army was on a raid, not a conquest. But the truth lives not in numbers, but in echoes. After Tours, the tide stopped. Islam remained in Spain, but would not advance further into Frankish lands. The line was drawn not in sand, but in blood. And Charles Martel, though he never wore a crown, had earned a throne in history. But the story of the Franks was just beginning. Their rise began not in royal courts, but in the shadow of kings. Since the days of Clovis, the first Frankish king to embrace Christianity, the Merovingian dynasty had ruled in name but dwindled in power. Long-haired monarchs, sacred in tradition but weak in practice, had become puppets in the hands of their chief ministers, the mayors of the palace. Charles Martel's father, Pepin of Herstal, had reunited the Frankish lands through cunning and force. His son, Charles, would defend them, but it was Charles's son, Pepin the Short, who would change the world. By 751, Pepin faced a question that would haunt medieval politics for centuries. If a man holds power, but not the title, is he not the true king? The answer came not from nobles, but from the heavens, or rather, from Rome. Pepin wrote to Pope Zachary, the Bishop of Bishops, asking a question both simple and seismic. Should the one who wields power be king, or the one who merely wears a crown? The Pope replied, in words that would shape the destiny of Europe, "It is better that he who holds the power of kingship should be called king than he who holds the title without the authority." With those words, the Merovingians were swept into history. Childeric III, the last of his line, was deposed, his sacred hair shorn, his body sent to a monastery. In his place, Pepin the Short was crowned not just by nobles, but by a bishop, and not merely elected, but anointed. For the first time in Frankish history, a king was crowned with holy oil. He was no longer merely a ruler by the sword, but by the grace of God. This moment did more than legitimize a dynasty. It forged a bond between the papacy and the Carolingians that would echo for 1,000 years. In 754, Pope Stephen II crossed the Alps to anoint Pepin again and beg his protection from the Lombards, those fierce northern Italians threatening papal lands. Pepin agreed. He marched south, defeated the Lombards, and donated their conquered territories to the Pope. This donation of Pepin became the foundation of the papal stateslands, not merely governed spiritually, but ruled outright by the Pope. A new idea had taken root, that kings could rise and fall, not by blood or battle alone, but by the blessing of the Church. When Pepin died in 768, he left the kingdom to his sons, Charlemagne and Charles. But fate, ever the quiet playwright, intervened. Charlemagne died suddenly, leaving young Charles as the sole ruler of the Franks. History would remember him as Charlemagne Charles the Great. He stood, it is said, a towering figure, nearly 7 feet tall, with piercing eyes and a boundless energy. But he was more than a warrior. He was a visionary. Charlemagne did not merely rule, he imagined. He saw not a kingdom, but an empire. Not a collection of tribes, but a Christian people. Not the past, but a future. His campaigns were relentless. Over 30 years of war against the Saxons brought Christianity, often by fire and sword, to the pagan forests of Germany. The defeat of the Avars in the east brought treasure and territory. The conquest of Lombardy made him king of Italy, and in the south, Charlemagne pushed into Spain, carving out a borderland called the Spanish March. There, in 778, his army suffered its only famous defeat in ambush in the narrow pass of Rongsbo, where Basque warriors slaughtered his rear guard. One of them was Roland, a Frankish commander whose death would inspire the Song of Roland, Europe's first great epic. The truth was less romantic, but the myth endured. Because by 800, Charlemagne's realm stretched from the Atlantic to the Danube, from the North Sea to Rome itself. It was the largest political entity in Western Europe since the Caesars. And then, on Christmas Day, in the year of our Lord 800, in the heart of ancient Christendom, a miracle of statecraft took place. In the old Basilica of St. Peter's in Rome, while Charlemagne knelt in prayer, Pope Leo III approached him. Before the assembled faithful, the Pope placed upon his head a golden crown and proclaimed, "Charles, most serene Augustus, crowned by God, great and pacific Emperor of the Romans." The crowd cried, Deo gratias. The world shifted. The Roman Empire had returned not in marble or senate, but in sword and scripture. The title of Emperor of the Romans, dormant in the West since 476, was reborn in the hands of a Frank. What was Charlemagne's reaction? Some say he was surprised, even annoyed, fearing that the Pope's gesture made him seem a vassal of the Church. Others believe it was carefully planned. But regardless of intent, the meaning was clear. The Pope had crowned an emperor. A priest had made a king. From that moment forward, the idea of a Christian empire Christendom took root. Charlemagne ruled not only with armies, but with ideas. He invited scholars from across Europe to his court, Alcuin of York, Paul the Deacon, Einhard. Together, they sparked what we now call the Carolingian Renaissance, revival of learning, literature, art, and administration. Latin was standardized, monastic schools were founded, manuscripts were copied with care and beauty in the new Carolingian minuscule script, so clear that we still use its descendants today. Charlemagne's realm was not just a battlefield, it was a library, a church, a workshop, a classroom. He built not only castles, but cathedrals. He died in 814, aged 72, and was buried in Aachen, his favored capital. His empire would not endure long after him. His sons and grandsons divided it. Vikings would raid its shores. Magyars would pillage its borders. But his legacy endured. Because Charlemagne did not merely rule land, he defined an idea that Europe could be united, that faith and power could coexist, that the memory of Rome, though buried, could be reborn in Christian form. In the crackling firelight of monasteries and in the echoing halls of cathedrals, his name would live on. The medieval world had taken its first true form not as a shadow of Rome, but as its heir. The Viking Age, often depicted as a dark time of raiding and savagery, was, in truth, a complex and transformative era that reshaped Europe in profound and enduring ways. While the popular imagination may focus on horned helmets, burning monasteries, and blood-stained axes, the reality was both more nuanced and more significant. The Vikings were not merely marauders, they were explorers, traders, settlers, and state builders. Their impact stretched far beyond the battlefield and into the very fabric of medieval European civilization. The initial spark of Viking expansion, as mentioned, was driven by a combination of population pressures, political centralization, and technological innovation. These were not unique to Scandinavia. Similar pressures had launched the migrations of the Goths, Vandals, and Huns centuries earlier. But what made the Viking response so unique was the combination of geography, seafaring expertise, and a deeply embedded warrior culture. Scandinavia, with its rugged terrain and long coastline, was naturally oriented toward the sea. The development of the longship, a sleek, fast, and versatile vessel, gave the Norse peoples a means of projecting power with unmatched mobility. These ships enabled the Vikings to exploit the vulnerabilities of early medieval Europe with devastating effectiveness. They could sail up rivers that larger ships could not navigate, strike deep into the heart of kingdoms, and vanish before a retaliatory force could be mustered. But they did not always vanish. Increasingly, Viking bands stayed, overwintered. The line between raider and ruler blurred. And over time, the Norse began to build not just encampments, but permanent holdings, fortresses, towns, and eventually states. One of the earliest and most notorious Viking targets was the British Isles. From the sack of Lindisfarne in 793, which shocked the Christian world with its brutality and desecration. To the establishment of the Dana law in the mid-9th century, the Vikings left an indelible mark on English history. They destroyed monasteries and looted treasures, but they also settled, intermarried, and eventually adopted Christianity themselves. The cities of York, Dublin, and others began as Viking trading posts, and their urban structures reflect the Norse influence to this day. The legacy of Viking language, law, and custom would blend with Anglo-Saxon traditions to form the cultural bedrock of medieval England. The same pattern occurred in Ireland, where Norse settlements laid the foundations for urban life in a land that had previously been organized around rural monastic centers. Dublin, founded by Vikings as a fortified trading hub, would grow into one of the most important cities in Irish history. In Scotland and the Isle of Man, Norse settlers mingled with local populations to create unique hybrid cultures, visible in art, law, and even the DNA of modern populations. The reach of the Vikings extended even further. In France, the most dramatic example was the creation of Normandy. In 911, the Frankish king Charles the Simple granted land around the Seine River to the Viking leader, Rollo, in exchange for military service and conversion to Christianity. This agreement marked the birth of the Duchy of Normandy, a powerful new polity that would one day produce William the Conqueror and alter the fate of England and Europe. The Normans, as Rollo's descendants came to be known, blended Norse vigor with Frankish administrative skill, creating a hybrid nobility that would become some of the most ambitious and mobile warriors of the medieval world. The eastward expansion of the Vikings is less celebrated in Western narratives, but equally significant. Swedish Vikings, known as the Russ, traveled deep into the river systems of Eastern Europe, establishing trade routes that linked the Baltic with the Black Sea and the Byzantine Empire. Along these routes, they founded key cities such as Novgorod and Kiev, laying the groundwork for what would become the Kievan Rasa powerful state that combined Norse ruling classes with Slavic populations and Orthodox Christian influence from Constantinople. This synthesis of cultures was a direct precursor to the emergence of Russian identity, and the name Russia itself derives from the Rus. These Eastern Vikings, far from being mere pirates, became vital links in the complex trade networks that connected Northern Europe with the Islamic world and Byzantium. They brought furs, slaves, and amber southward, and returned with silk, spices, and silver. The Arabic dirhams found in Scandinavian graves attest to the vast reach of Viking commerce. Their travels extended as far as Baghdad, and some accounts suggest Norse mercenaries even served in the elite Varangian guard of the Byzantine emperors. What united all these disparate Viking endeavors was a shared cultural ethos, one built around honor, reputation, and the pursuit of fame. This was an age in which heroic poetry, such as the Icelandic sagas and the Old English Beowulf, celebrated not only courage and martial prowess, but also generosity, loyalty, and cunning. Viking society was hierarchical but fluid. A man of talent and bravery could rise through the ranks, gather followers, and carve out his own kingdom. It was a world that prized deeds over birth and demanded constant proof of one's worth. Religiously, the early Viking world was polytheistic and deeply spiritual. Norse mythology offered a rich pantheon of gods and goddesses: Odin, the Allfather; Thor, the Thunderer; Freya, the goddess of fertility, alongside a cosmology of worlds bound by Yggdrasil, the world tree. Fate, or word, was central to Norse belief. the idea that each person had a destiny woven by the Norns, and that the most one could do was to meet it with courage. The fatalism of Norse religion lent a distinct flavor to Viking warfare. To die in battle was to earn a place in Valhalla, where fallen heroes feasted and fought for eternity. Christian Europe viewed these beliefs with horror and fascination. The clash between the Norse gods and the Christian Trinity was more than theological, it was civilizational. Yet, even as they raided monasteries and slaughtered monks, the Vikings also engaged with Christian society. Some converted early, often for political reasons. Others held out until well into the 10th and 11th centuries. But the tide was inexorable. As the Viking Age progressed, conversion became both a reality and a necessity. Christian kingship offered legitimacy and access to diplomatic alliances. Baptism opened the doors to European courts and ecclesiastical recognition. By the 11th century, nearly all the Scandinavian kingdoms had embraced Christianity. And with that, the Viking Age, as it had been traditionally understood, came to an end. However, the legacy of the Vikings endured. The political entities they founded, Normandy, the Kievan Rus, the Kingdom of Dublin, would play central roles in medieval European history. Their innovations in shipbuilding, warfare, and exploration continued to shape the continent. Even the idea of kingship was altered by the Viking model, which emphasized personal valor and the ability to command loyalty over mere inheritance. The impact of the Viking Age can also be seen in the legal codes of the North, many of which were later incorporated into national laws. Norse influence in language is still visible in English, especially in the north of England, where words like sky, egg, knife, and window have Norse roots. Perhaps most remarkably, the Viking spirit of exploration did not end in Europe. It pushed further still. In the late 10th century, Norse settlers reached Iceland and Greenland. Around the year 1000, Leif Erikson, the son of Eric the Red, sailed west from Greenland and landed on the shores of what he called Vinland, likely somewhere in Newfoundland, Canada. This event, recorded in the Saga of the Greenlanders, makes the Norse the first Europeans to set foot on North American soil nearly 5 centuries before Columbus. In this way, the Viking legacy spans not just time but continents. From the monasteries of England to the steppes of Russia, from the cathedrals of Normandy to the fjords of Iceland, the Vikings reshaped the medieval world. They were destroyers, yes, but also creators. They left behind more than ashes and fear. They left towns, states, and enduring cultural forms. The very fear they inspired forced Europe to adapt, to fortify, to unify. Castles, feudal levies, and standing militias all owe part of their development to the Viking threat. The Carolingian world cracked under the pressure, but what rose in its place was stronger, more coherent, more resilient. The story of the Vikings is ultimately a story of transformation of Europe, of Scandinavia, and of the world. It is a story not only of swords and sails, but of trade, travel, and tremendous cultural exchange. As the Viking Age drew to a close in the 11th century, its effects could be felt everywhere. In the growing power of European monarchies, in the fusion of Norse and Christian traditions, in the opening of new frontiers, and in the enduring myths that would captivate generations to come. In the twilight of the Viking Age, as Scandinavia was drawn more deeply into the orbit of Christian Europe, the old ways gave way to new forms. But the spirit of the Vikings, their daring, their independence, their relentless pursuit of adventure and glory, remained etched into the soul of Europe. It is no coincidence that the medieval epic and the modern imagination alike still find something irresistible in these northern warriors. They were not just men of their time, they were architects of a new era. The story of the Vikings is not just one of savagery and conquest. These Northmen, merging from the cold reaches of Scandinavia, were as much creators as they were destroyers, as deeply involved in trade and state-building as they were in pillaging. Their longships carried more than axes and shields. They transported goods like amber from the Baltic, furs from the Arctic, and silver from the Islamic world. With this combination of power and pragmatism, the Vikings helped forge a new European order. It began with terrifying raids, yes, but quickly evolved into something much more transformative. When the Viking Age first dawned, it did so with violence. The infamous raid on Lindisfarne in 793 signaled the beginning. Viking fleets, sleek, fast, and almost impossible to predict, would descend on coastal towns and monasteries, plundering gold, silver, manuscripts, and slaves. Their attacks were seasonal. They would arrive in the summer, strike quickly, and return to their homelands for winter. This pattern continued throughout the early 800s, and the shock was devastating. But by the mid-9th century, things began to shift. The Vikings were no longer content with seasonal loot. They came to stay. In 865, what became known as the Great Heathen Army landed in England. Unlike previous raiding parties, this was a full-scale military invasion, with the intent not just to plunder, but to conquer and settle. Led by legendary figures like Ivar the Boneless and Halfdan Ragnarsson, they tore through the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, establishing control over the north and east of England, a territory known as the Danelaw. What remained of Anglo-Saxon resistance was gradually reduced to tributary status. The Viking conquerors didn't just impose rule through terror, they brought structure, legal traditions from Scandinavia, agricultural innovations, and an extensive network of trade routes followed them into their new domains. Thing assemblies, local gatherings for governance and legal dispute were introduced, laying the groundwork for representative government in parts of Europe. Their economy, too, became global in scope. Viking merchants circulated silver dirhams from the Islamic Caliphate across the known world, from Greenland in the west to Central Asia in the east. Even more remarkable was the cultural transformation that followed. Despite arriving as pagans and outsiders, the Vikings rapidly assimilated into the societies they conquered. In Normandy, for example, a Viking leader named Rollo, after years of ravaging the French coast, to a formal treaty with King Charles the Simple in 911. In exchange for defending the Seine River against further Viking attacks, Rollo was granted a large territory. This area would become Normandy, and Rollo would become its first duke. The changes that followed were astonishing. Within 2 generations, the descendants of these pagan invaders had become thoroughly Christian, culturally Frankish, and linguistically French. And yet, they retained their ancestral military prowess. It was this synthesis of Viking boldness and Frankish civilization that would produce one of the most formidable warrior classes in medieval Europe. Duke William of Normandy, descended from Rollo, would lead a Norman army to victory at Hastings in 1066, changing the course of English history forever. The Vikings also left their mark far beyond Western Europe. In Ireland, Norse settlers founded the first urban center cities like Dublin and Waterford. In the east, Viking traders, known as Varangians, navigated the river systems of Russia, establishing trading posts and forming the foundation of what would become the Kievan Rus, These Norse adventurers would eventually convert to Orthodox Christianity and become the ruling elite of early Russia. But the Vikings were not the only threat reshaping Europe in the 9th and 10th centuries. From the east came another terror, the Magyars. These nomadic horsemen ancestors of modern Hungarians rode westward from the Eurasian steppe into the Carpathian Basin around 895. Their tactics mirrored those of the earlier Huns, lightly armed, highly mobile, and fiercely independent. The Magyars launched devastating raids across Central and Western Europe. Where the Vikings came by sea, the Magyars came by land, striking Bavaria one day, Burgundy the next, vanishing into the distance before any army could catch them. Their attacks were not merely economic, they threatened the very survival of existing societies. The sheer speed and ferocity of Magyar raids sowed fear throughout Europe, one chronicler wrote. They came like lightning and vanished like thunder, leaving nothing but death and fire behind. Their composite bows pierced armor at long distances. Their small ponies thrived on bark and grass, giving them unmatched mobility. And their battlefield tactics, feigned retreats, flanking maneuvers, were honed over generations of steppe warfare. Cities like Regensburg and Pavia were sacked, monasteries were razed, populations were slaughtered or enslaved. For Christian Europe, the Magyars seemed like a punishment sent by God-apocalyptic horsemen straight from the Book of Revelation. That is, until the year 955. At the Battle of Lechfeld, Otto I of Germany decisively defeated the Magyars in a campaign that would mark the turning point. The battle shattered the Magyars' ability to wage war in their traditional fashion. Otto's use of heavy cavalry-armored knights capable of withstanding and breaking through the Magyars' ranks proved decisive. Within a generation, the Magyars had abandoned their nomadic ways, converted to Christianity, and established the Christian Kingdom of Hungary under King Stephen I. While Vikings harassed Europe from the north, and Magyars stormed in from the east, a third threat rose from the south. Muslim raiders from Spain and North Africa launched attacks across the Mediterranean. These Saracen pirates established fortified bases in places like southern France, Corsica, and Sardinia. From these strongholds, they launched deep raids into Christian territory, even threatening Rome itself. One of their most strategic outposts, Fraxinetum in Provence, allowed them to dominate the Alpine passes and disrupt trade and communication between Italy and the rest of Western Europe for decades. In the face of these triple invasions, Viking Magyar and Muslim Europe's old military systems were overwhelmed. The Carolingian model of a centralized royal army raised for seasonal campaigns simply could not respond fast enough. Something had to change, and it did. A military revolution swept across Europe, driven by necessity. Two key developments reshaped warfare: the rise of the knight and the spread of castles. The first was made possible by a technological innovation, the stirrup. Likely introduced from Asia in the 8th century, the stirrup allowed warriors to fight from horseback with stability and power. It transformed cavalry into a shock force. No longer were mounted troops, lightly armed scouts, or skirmishers. They became the dominant force on the battlefield. The medieval knight, clad in armor and wielding a lance, was born. This shift gave rise to a new warrior elite, the mounted nobles who would come to dominate European society. The knight, militarily effective, socially prestigious, and economically independent. Alongside this came the fortification revolution. In the 9th and 10th centuries, thousands of castles and fortified towns sprang up across Europe. These were not merely symbols of feudal lords' power, they were critical for defense. A Viking army might overrun a monastery or a village, but a well-defended stone keep could resist even determined attackers. Fortified bridges and strongholds dotted the rivers and roads, limiting enemy mobility and providing refuge for the surrounding population. This new military and social order had profound political consequences. As royal authority weakened in the face of external threats, local leaders' counts, dukes, bishops, took on more power. Those who could protect their lands became de facto rulers. Feudalism emerged not as a grand design, but as a survival mechanism. Land was exchanged for military service. Loyalty replaced bureaucracy. The empire of Charlemagne, fragmented but out of the cracks, emerged something new, and something stronger. Paradoxically, the invasions that threatened to destroy Europe ended up strengthening it. The Viking settlements revived trade and urban life. The Magyar raids accelerated the development of knightly warfare. Muslim incursions forced European powers to fortify and consolidate. Each wave of invasion pushed Europeans to adapt, innovate, and build stronger institutions. By the year 1000, the chaos had begun to settle. The Vikings were no longer raiders, but rulers. The Magyars had become Christian kings. Muslim raiders had been driven out or neutralized. In the place of a crumbling Carolingian order, new kingdoms began to rise: France, Germany, England, each rooted in the legacy of Charlemagne, but shaped by the crucible of invasion. Perhaps most profoundly, a new sense of European identity had taken root. The peoples of the continent, once fragmented by tribe, dialect, and custom, had been forced by shared suffering and shared struggle to see themselves as part of a greater whole. They were no longer just Saxons, Franks, or Lombards. They were defenders of Christendom. In the end, the invaders who seemed destined to destroy Christian Europe ended up forging its future. The fires of invasion tempered the steel of a civilization that would soon rise to dominate the world. The Northmen who erupted into the European scene in the 8th and 9th centuries were a paradox. At once destroyers and creators, raiders and traders, pagans, and eventually Christians. Their legacy is far more complex than their initial image as brutal plunderers. Their sleek dragon ships sliced through the waves, not just bearing warriors and axes, but also commodities from the Baltic, furs from the Arctic, and silver from the Islamic world. From these vessels flowed not only destruction, but commerce. Viking trade routes stretched from Dublin to Kiev. They founded the first Russian state and opened up thriving commercial arteries, linking Western Europe to Byzantium and the Islamic caliphates of the East. Their earliest raids. By summer's end, these warriors would vanish, retreating to their Scandinavian homelands for the winter. It was a seasonal devastation that Christian Europe struggled to predict or repel. But this phase didn't last. By the mid-9th century, the Vikings were no longer content with smash-and-grab raids. A transformation was underway. In 865, the arrival of the so-called Great Heathen Army marked a new chapter not of fleeting attacks, but of conquest and colonization. Under leaders like Ivar the Boneless and Halfdan Ragnarsson, these Norse invaders didn't merely pillage, they stayed. They carved out permanent dominions in Anglo-Saxon England, creating the Danelaw in the north and east, turning once powerful kingdoms into tributary states. Far from being barbaric occupiers, the Vikings brought with them sophisticated systems. Their thing, assemblies gatherings, where free men debated laws, provided early templates for representative governance. Their agricultural expertise and extensive trading networks invigorated stagnant European economies. They didn't just take, they built. Silver dirhams from the Muslim world passed through Viking hands from Greenland to Central Asia, circulating in a market economy more global than any Europe had known in centuries. And perhaps most astonishingly, these fierce pagan warriors proved exceptionally adaptable. The Vikings, who settled in Normandy under the leadership of Rollo, the same Rollo, who once laid waste to the coasts of Francia, transformed into ardent Christians. In 911, Rollo struck a deal with King Charles the Simple in exchange for protecting the Seine River Valley from future Viking attacks. This unique hybrid gave rise to the most formidable warrior elite in Europe, and their ultimate triumph came in 1066. When Duke William of Normandy, Rollo's great-great-grandson, invaded England and crushed King Harold at Hastings, fusing Norse ambition with Frankish statecraft and papal blessing. But the Vikings were only one prong of a broader existential threat facing Europe in the 9th and 10th centuries. From the east came another Menesta Magirs, nomadic horsemen from the Eurasian steppes. The Magirs were masters of mobility, their tactics echoing those of the Huns who had terrorized Europe centuries earlier. Around 895, they swept into the Carpathian Basin and began launching ferocious raids into Central and Western Europe. Where Viking attacks were seasonal and maritime Magyars struck across land, riding fast and hard across open terrain. Entire regions, Bavaria, Burgundy, Lombardy, were laid waste before a coherent response could be mustered. Their composite bows could pierce armor from long range. Their small, hardy horses could survive on bark and grass, and their deceptive tactics feigned retreats. Sudden ambushes left conventional armies bewildered. Contemporary chronicles describe their assaults with horror. The Hungarians came like lightning, wrote one witness, and departed like thunder, leaving only fire and corpses behind. Monasteries from Regensburg to Tours were torched. Cities from Pavia too were sacked. Fields were burned, villages annihilated, and survivors carried off as slaves. Yet as terrifying as they were, the Magyar raids forced European rulers to adapt. The turning point came in 955 at the Battle of Lechfeld. There, Otto I of Germany marshaled a disciplined army and crushed the Magyar threat in a decisive victory, embraced Christianity, and adopted feudal governance under King Stephen I. Even as Europe reeled from Viking and Magyar assaults, a third front opened. From the south came Muslim raids launched from North Africa and Islamic Spain. Saracen fleets captured strategic ports in southern France, Corsica, and Sardinia. From these bases, they launched deeper incursions into Christian Europe. For decades, the Muslim fortress of Fraxinetum controlled vital Alpine passes, severing Italy from the rest of the continent and strangling trade and communication. Its military, designed for conventional wars between kingdoms, proved woefully inadequate against unpredictable mobile raiders. The response was nothing short of revolutionary. Europe transformed itself militarily, politically, and economically. The stirrup, an invention likely imported from Central Asia, revolutionized mounted combat. For the first time, a fully armored warrior could remain stable while delivering a devastating lance charge from horseback. Thus emerged the Miles, or knight, the heavily armored cavalryman who would dominate medieval warfare for centuries. These warriors were expensive to equip and train, and so feudalism emerged as a system to support them. Simultaneously, Europe turned to defense in depth. Castles, initially wooden Matonda-Bailey structures, began dotting the landscape in the thousands. Towns fortified their walls. Bridges were fortified to control key crossings. These were not castles of romance, but of survival. A Viking warband might sack an abbey or a village, but even a small stone fort could resist and protect the population. Over time, these fortresses evolved into administrative and political centers. This shift had profound political consequences. The centralized apparatus of the Carolingians gave way to decentralized rule. Local lords who could offer protection became more powerful than distant kings who could not. Thus was born the feudal order, a web of oaths, obligations, and loyalties that governed land, war, and justice. But even this fragmentation masked a deeper consolidation. By the year 1000, the worst of the invasions had passed. The Vikings, who didn't settle, had been absorbed into Scandinavian kingdoms Denmark, Norway, Sweden. The Magyars had become Christian Hungarians. Muslim raiding parties were increasingly checked by local defenses or driven back. Out of chaos, a new order was emerging. This was the true dawn of medieval Europe. The polyglot peoples of the former Roman world had been bound together by shared trauma and transformation. Latin Christianity had become the dominant cultural and religious force from the British Isles to southern Italy. The feudal system provided a consistent framework for political and military organization, and knighthood, its rituals, obligations, and ideals created a pan-European warrior class that transcended language and ethnicity. Nothing symbolized this transformation more than the Cluniac reform movement. Founded in 909, the monastery of Cluny ignited a spiritual revival that spread across Europe. Its emphasis on moral integrity, beautiful liturgy, and monastic independence reinvigorated Christian institutions at every level. At a time when Europe had been on the brink of collapse, Cluny and its affiliates built networks of influence that defied borders and rivaled kingdoms. As the first millennium approached, fear of apocalypse mingled with a new confidence. The invasions that once seemed like divine punishment had catalyzed rebirth. From destruction had come resilience, reform, and innovation. The Vikings, who burned Paris, now ruled Normandy as Christian dukes. The Magyars, who raided Germany, now defended Europe's eastern frontier. The Muslims, who once raided Provence, had been contained behind the Pyrenees and integrated into a new diplomatic reality in Iberia. Europe, in the year 1000, was no longer a continent on the defensive. The age of external invasion was ending. The age of European expansion was beginning. The knights who had once fended off steppe raiders would soon ride eastward on crusade. The merchants who had bartered with Norsemen would establish commercial empires, reaching the Holy Land, the Black Sea, and beyond. The kings who had struggled to maintain order would now dream of empire. And on a cold October day in 1066, the last Anglo-Saxon king fell at Hastings. Harold Godwinson died with an arrow through his eye, and with him passed the old order of England. But what replaced it was not just a new ruler, was a new civilization. The Norman knights who crushed Harold's army weren't simply foreign invaders. They were the culmination of 3 centuries of transformation. Vikings turned Frenchmen, pagans turned Christians, raiders turned rulers. The Europe that emerged from this crucible was something entirely new. It was feudal, it was Christian, and it was unmistakably medieval. Stone castles rose from the hills. Knights pledged loyalty to lords and kings. Cathedrals soared toward the heavens. Monasteries teemed with learning and industry. It was a civilization in which spiritual and secular power intertwined and often collided, where personal bonds replaced imperial law, and where loyalty was the glue that held society together. To understand this revolutionary world, we must begin with the heart of its organization, the feudal bond. This was no abstract legal contract, was deeply personal. A vassal, kneeling before his lord, placed his hands in his lord's and swore loyalty. In return, he received land of fiefdom, which to build his life, support his arms, and fulfill his obligations. The ritual had almost religious gravity. "I become your man," the vassal would say, "and I promise to serve you faithfully against all men who may live or die." The lord, in turn, owed protection and justice. This reciprocity defined the political structure of Europe. Kings, dukes, counts, barons all were bound in a lattice of interlocking loyalties and responsibilities. Feudalism, however, was never uniform. In northern France, it formed vast pyramids of vassalage, with the king at the top. In Germany, older tribal customs persisted alongside feudal innovation. In pre-conquest England, land tenure mattered more than personal oath. But after 1066, William the Conqueror changed that. He reshaped England with ruthless precision, creating a system in which every landholder ultimately owed allegiance to the crown. His great servitor, Domesday Bookric, courted every field, every manor, every obligation, binding the land to its king more tightly than ever before. Across Europe, monarchs followed suit. In France, the Capetians began consolidating their power. In Germany, the Ottonians revived the dream of a Christian empire. Otto I's coronation in 962 created the Holy Roman Empire, though it was never truly holy, seldom Roman, and barely an empire. It was a fragile federation held together by imperial charisma and religious legitimacy. The emperors relied heavily on the church, appointing bishops and abbots as governors and generals. This gave rise to one of medieval Europe's most distinctive institutions, the imperial church, but it also sparked conflict. When Pope Gregory VII claimed the right to depose emperors, all hell broke loose. Thus began the investiture controversy. At its dramatic height, Emperor Henry IV stood barefoot in the snow at Canossa, begging the Pope for forgiveness. It was theater, but also politics. By appearing penitent, Henry won back moral legitimacy and crushed his enemies. The conflict symbolized a larger struggle, church versus state, spirit versus sword. And it was driven by reform. Cluny's ideals had spread to the secular clergy, demanding celibacy, denouncing corruption, and asserting papal supremacy. A new Reformed church had emerged, confident, institutionalized, and ready to challenge emperors. And so, the Europe forged in fire during the 9th and 10th centuries did not merely survive, it flourished. Its feudal structure, its Christian faith, its Reformed church, and its militarized aristocracy laid the foundation for the next great phase, the age of crusades, cathedrals, and kingdoms. From the chaos of invasion had risen a new world, resilient, united, and unmistakably medieval. The flames of Rome, once the torchbearer of the Western world, flickered in the twilight of an age. They had warmed emperors and armies, poets and prophets, beggars and builders, for over 1,000 years. But now the embers glowed faintly, glowing less with triumph than with memory. On a dusky September evening in the year 476 CE, the final act of an ancient empire unfolded, not in battle, but in stillness. A Germanic general named Odoacer walked through the marble halls of the imperial palace in Ravenna. His footfalls rang through corridors that had once trembled at the approach of Caesar's legions. The mosaics still glittered with the gold of Byzantium, and the ceilings still arched heavenward in imitation of Roman divinity. But the empire those stones had borne witness to was already a ghost, and the boy who awaited him, Romulus Augustulus, the so-called Little Augustus, was no Caesar. He was 16, soft-eyed and uncertain, his imperial purple too large for his shoulders. A child emperor, placed upon the throne not by triumph or lineage, but by the hand of his father, a usurper of a fading dream. Even his name seemed a cruel echo. Romulus, like the founder of Rome; Augustulus, the diminutive of Augustus. He was not a ruler. He was a shadow of echoes, a symbol for an empire that had already died in the minds of many. Odoacer approached with neither sword drawn nor insult spoken. He did not strike the boy down. Instead, he offered a gesture of finality clothed in grace. The diadem was removed, the scepter laid gently aside. The imperial cloak woven with centuries of pride was lifted from the boy's shoulders. Then Odoacer placed the symbols of empire into a chest, and that chest was sent eastward across the Adriatic Sea to Constantinople. There, the message was clear and cold. The Western Empire had no need of an emperor. The experiment was over, and yet no crowds filled the forum. No citizens wept openly in the streets. No senate convened to lament the passing of the Roman world. Romulus was quietly pensioned off to a villa in Campania, where he lived out the rest of his days, not as a fallen monarch, but as a footnote in the great ledger of time. But that moment, as silent as snowfall, rang through the ages like the final toll of a funeral bell. What ended in that room was not just a boy's reign or even an empire. It was the ancient world itself, the civilization that had once stretched from Hadrian Wall in Britain to the burning deserts of Arabia. A world of aqueducts and amphitheaters, of philosophers and Caesars, of gods who walked in marble was no more. And yet, as with so many things in history, the end was not sudden. It was not a single blow, but a slow, weary crumbling. By the time Odoacer entered the palace, the Western Roman Empire was already hollowed out. The Rome of Augustus or Marcus Aurelius had long faded. The senators still wore togas, but their voices held no power. The cities still bore Latin names, but their walls were cracked and their forums silent. Roman generals now commanded armies of Germanic tribes. Roman taxes were collected by foreign kings. The mighty structure had not been toppled, but weathered, eroded by time, by greed, by forgetfulness. The truth was, Rome had not been conquered in the old-fashioned sense. It had been inherited. The so-called barbarians who took up her mantle were not wild men with no concept of civilization. They were warriors, yes, but also statesmen. They had served in Rome's legions, read Roman texts, worshipped in Roman churches. They admired Rome not for its marble, but for its meaning. They did not wish to burn the empire. They wanted to own it, to live within its framework, to continue its glory under their own banners. But something crucial was lost, something intangible but profound. The idea of unity. For nearly 1,000 years, Rome had represented one empire, one law, one ruler, a unifying thread tied together the distant provinces of Britain and Egypt, of Gaul and Judea. Even when that unity was shaky, even when rebellions stirred, there had always been the idea of Rome to return to. After 476, that idea no longer held. The empire fractured into shards. No new Augustus arose to knit the world back together. In the west, power fragmented into kingdoms: Visigothic Spain, Vandal North Africa, Frankish Gaul, and Ostrogothic Italy. Each saw itself as the heir of Rome. None truly was. In the Italian peninsula, it was Theodoric the Great who now wore the crown not of a Caesar, but of a king. And in him paradox lived. Theodoric was born a Gothic prince, yet raised as a hostage in the golden halls of Constantinople. There he had studied Roman law and politics, perhaps never fully mastering the written word, but deeply absorbing the rhythms of the empire. When he took power in Italy, he ruled with both sword and senate. Roman rituals continued under his gaze. The curia still met. Latin was still spoken. Roads were kept. Aqueducts repaired. He did not destroy the Roman legacy. He sought to preserve it. But always, in the background, stood the reminder: this was not Rome, not as it once was. Theodoric's rule was a marriage between two worlds, Roman legalism and Gothic custom, coexisting under a fragile peace. In his kingdom, Roman citizens were judged by Roman law, Goths by Gothic law. It was a dual system, elegant in theory, tense in practice. But for a time, Italy knew stability, perhaps the last it would know for many generations. Yet even this flicker of peace could not undo the deeper unraveling. The lifeblood of remit cities were fading. With trade routes broken and imperial resources gone, urban centers withered. Once grand cities fell into silence. Rome, the eternal city, once bursting with over 1 million souls, now shrank to a village of 50,000. People turned inward, turned rural, turned local. And as the old imperial order receded, a new kind of power stepped forward, clothed not in purple, but in vestments of faith. The Christian Church had once been an underground movement, persecuted and reviled. But by the 5th century, it had become the one institution still standing when all others fell. Its bishops were not only preachers, they were protectors. They fed the hungry, negotiated with warlords, kept order when magistrates fled. One of the most vivid moments of this rising authority came in 452, when Pope Leo the Great met Attila the Hun outside the gates of Rome. He came not with an army, but with faith, and Attila, the so-called scourge of God, turned back. From then on, popes were more than spiritual guides. They became political actors. They claimed supremacy over the Christian world, not just over other bishops, but even over kings. This growing power would reach a new height with Pope Gregory the Great, who led the Church from 590 to 604. He governed a Rome that had no emperor. Its civic functions had collapsed. Its defenders fled. And into that void stepped Gregory. He organized defenses, distributed grain, kept order. But more than that, he looked outward. Gregory understood that the old Roman Empire could not be revived in its old form. Instead, he imagined a new kind of empire, spiritual, transcendent, Catholic. He sent missionaries to distant lands, including to the pagan kingdoms of Britain. There, a monk named Augustine, not the famous theologian, but a humble servant of Gregory, planted the seeds of Christian faith that would one day reshape the Isles. While the West transformed, the East still endured. In Constantinople, the Eastern Roman Empire, what we now call Byzantium, still flew the imperial banners. Its emperors saw themselves as the true heirs of Augustus, and they viewed the Western kingdoms not as partners, but as trespassers. One such emperor, Justinian, dreamed of restoring the old empire. In the year 533, he sent his great general Belisarius to recapture North Africa from the Vandals. The campaign was swift and dazzling. Then came Italy. The Gothic wars followed a brutal, drawn-out conflict that devastated the land. Rome itself changed hands multiple times. Cities burned, populations fled. The very soil seemed exhausted. Though Justinian would technically reclaim Italy, it came at a dreadful cost. Theodoric's kingdom of fragile peace was gone, replaced by a Byzantine administration too distant to protect the people. In trying to revive Rome, Justinian had perhaps delivered its final blow. From the rubble rose new invaders, the Lombards fierce and foreign. They poured into Italy, establishing their own rule, carving the land once more into pieces. By the late 6th century, the dream of a unified classical Rome was irretrievably gone. Trade was local, limited to regional exchanges. Towns became fortresses. Learning was kept not in libraries, but in monasteries, where monks copied ancient manuscripts by candlelight. Law became personal and tribal, no longer the universal code of Rome, but a patchwork of Germanic customs and Christian values. Yet this was not the end of civilization. It was a chrysalis. In Ireland, monks preserved Plato and Virgil. In Frankish lands, kings experimented with fusing Roman bureaucracy with Germanic power. New models of leadership emerged, not imperial, but feudal, local, but binding. The empire had fallen, yes, but in its fall, it scattered seeds. And from those seeds, a new world would grow, a world of knights and castles, of saints and scholars, of kings and popes. A world we would come to call medieval Europe. By the close of the 11th century, Western Europe had undergone a profound transformation. The ecclesiastical world had changed dramatically. The church, once subordinate to secular lords and monarchs, asserted unprecedented authority. The establishment of the College of Cardinals ensured that papal succession could no longer be manipulated by imperial or aristocratic factions. Canon law, now codified systematically, began to rival and even supersede secular law, giving the papacy judicial clout across Europe. 11th century European Renaissance. Europe's population was growing after centuries of demographic stagnation. New agricultural techniques, such as the heavy plow, the horse collar, and the three-field system, boosted productivity and supported growing communities. Towns and cities dormant, or non-existent for centuries emerged across the continent as hubs of commerce, trade, and intellectual life. Northern Italy and Flanders saw the rise of communes, urban political entities built not on feudal obligations, but on commercial relationships. Among them, Venice stood as a paradigm. Lacking fertile land or natural resources, its ducats became the standard currency of Mediterranean commerce. Genoa, Pisa, and the cities of the Hanseatic League followed suit, turning the North and Baltic Seas into zones of intense economic exchange. These changes prompted a commercial revolution, which in turn demanded new forms of finance, letters of credit, joint stock companies, double-entry bookkeeping, and legal instruments for resolving disputes across jurisdictions. This new economic order necessitated education. Urban schools proliferated to train literate, numerate merchants and bureaucrats, while cathedral schools preserved and expanded classical learning. The rediscovery of Aristotle through Arabic sources began to reshape European philosophy and science. Yet, even amid such flourishing, tensions abounded. Feudal values were deeply entrenched, and the emerging urban bourgeoisie often clashed ideologically and economically with the knightly class. Knights, hereditary warriors, schooled in violence, viewed commerce with suspicion. The Church warned that profit was morally hazardous and wealth a spiritual burden. These cultural tensions mirrored deeper societal conflicts. Knights of the 11th century were not the courtly chivalric figures of later romance, but brutal and pragmatic military professionals. Heavy cavalry tactics, honed in response to Viking and Magyar invasions, gave them supremacy on the battlefield. Over time, this martial class developed into a self-conscious caste. By 1100, knighthood had become hereditary, accompanied by elaborate rituals that imbued it with quasi-religious meaning. A young man entering knighthood would fast, confess, and receive his sword in a consecrated ceremony. The blessing of his weapons signified his new mission, the protection of the weak and the defense of the Church. Despite these lofty ideals, knights often terrorized local populations and waged petty wars for personal gain. Knights were becoming agents of conquest, not just local violence. The Reconquista exemplified this transformation. Christian kingdoms like Castile, Navarre, and Aragon gradually pushed southward, seizing territory from Muslim rulers. The conquest of Toledo in 1085 by Alfonso VI marked a pivotal moment, signaling Christian ascendancy. Though the Almoravid dynasty from North Africa would later mount a counteroffensive, the basic dynamic endured. Christian heavy cavalry, religious zeal, and political consolidation continued to erode Muslim control in Iberia. Norman adventurers, meanwhile, conquered Sicily and southern Italy, creating hybrid states blending Latin, Byzantine, and Islamic traditions. In Eastern Europe, German knights moved beyond the Elbe River, colonizing pagan lands through a mixture of military force and missionary work. A new confidence animated the Christian West. Into this world, a call to holy war reverberated like thunder. In 1095, at the Council of Clermont, Pope Urban II rose before a crowd of nobles, clergy, and commoners to deliver a speech that would echo for centuries. Urban depicted a Christian East under siege. Pilgrims to Jerusalem were being attacked, the Holy Sepulchre defiled. Muslims, described in stark and brutal terms, were violating Christendom's most sacred spaces. Urban's solution was unprecedented, a holy war. Knights, he said, could cleanse their sins not through penance, but through arms by killing the enemies of God. Violence, long condemned, could now be redemptive. Most revolutionary of all was Urban's promise of a plenary indulgence, complete forgiveness of all sins for those who took the cross and died in battle. The offer of guaranteed salvation electrified the crowd. Deus vult, they cried. God wills it. Urban had tapped into something profound. Centuries of religious reform, the growing assertiveness of papal authority, the military energy of feudal society, and the cultural tensions between sacred and secular power. The crusade was not a sudden aberration. It was the culmination of long-standing historical processes. The spark for Urban's call came from Byzantium. Emperor Alexios I Komnenos reeling from the catastrophic loss at Manzikert in 1071, had appealed to the Pope for help against the encroaching Seljuk Turks. Urban seized the opportunity. Aid to the east would enhance the papacy's influence, help unify Christendom, and redirect Western violence outward. But what followed exceeded all expectations. The First Crusade became a mass movement. Great lords mortgaged lands and raised armies. Peasants sold all they owned. Even children attempted to reach the Holy Land in tragic children's crusades. The first wave, Peter, the Hermit's People's Crusade, was a disaster. Ill-prepared and lacking military discipline, they were slaughtered by the Turks in Anatolia. The real armies that followed were different. Led by powerful nobles Godfrey of Bouillon, Raymond of Toulouse, Bohemond of Taranto, they were organized, experienced, and committed. These were not raiders, but mobile societies, with supply lines, engineers, religious officials, and a vision of long-term conquest. The Siege of Antioch in 1097–98 highlighted the grueling nature of crusading warfare. For 8 months, the Crusaders endured starvation and repeated attacks before the city finally fell. A relic, the Holy Lance, allegedly the spear that pierced Christ's side, was discovered, infusing the exhausted soldiers with renewed spiritual fervor. Visions, relics, and religious rituals played a central role in motivating these men. Spiritual belief became tactical advantage. On July 15, 1099, Jerusalem fell. The conquest shocked the Muslim world and horrified even many contemporaries. Crusaders massacred inhabitants indiscriminately. Blood ran through the streets. But for Europeans, the event marked the culmination of divine will. Jerusalem had been redeemed. Latin Christendom had triumphed. 4 Crusader states emerged: the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Edessa, the Principality of Antioch, and the County of Tripoli. These were not temporary military bases, but full-fledged colonies, complete with European feudal systems, laws, and Latin churches. They were outposts of Western civilization embedded in the Islamic world. Their survival, however, was tenuous. Surrounded by hostile populations, they depended on reinforcements and financial support from Europe. To sustain them, new institutions were required. Chief among them were the military orders, the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller. The Templars, formed around 1119 to protect pilgrims, combined monastic life with military service. The Hospitallers evolved from caregivers into soldiers. These orders swore religious vows, built massive fortifications, and became the backbone of the Crusader defense. Their international networks collected money and recruits from across Europe. Yet the very dependence of the Crusader states on European support was also their greatest vulnerability. When interest waned or political priorities shifted in Europe, reinforcements dried up. This fragility was revealed starkly in 1144 when the Muslim commander Zengi captured Edessa, triggering the Second Crusade. The response was immediate and grand. Kings themselves took the cross, Louis VII of France and Conrad III of Germany. Preached by the influential Bernard of Clairvaux, the Second Crusade was the most prestigious expedition since the first, but it ended in failure. Both armies were defeated before reaching Jerusalem. The loss was a severe blow to the morale of Christian Europe. And yet, despite such setbacks, the crusading movement endured. It had become a permanent feature of Christian life, politics, and ideology. Pilgrimage and warfare had merged. Feudal violence had found new purpose, papal power reached its zenith, but the age of crusades would continue with triumphs and tragedies, alike for another 2 centuries. For the first time, European Christians were forced to confront a deeply unsettling idea that God might not always favor his warriors. That divine blessing, once presumed to accompany their swords, could be withheld. This theological crisis was no small tremor. It shook the very foundations of Christian self-understanding. Had sin infected their armies? Had hubris led them astray? Or was it simply that their enemies, too, were guided by a divine hand? As this unsettling doubt spread through the West, it prepared the ground for one of the most remarkable military campaigns in medieval history. At the center of it stood Saladin Kurdish, general of immense charisma and tactical genius. Under his banner, Egypt and Syria were unified for the first time in generations. In Saladin, the Islamic world found the kind of leadership the Christian West so often lacked: disciplined, devout, and focused. The Crusader states, by contrast, had grown complacent, fragmented, infighting, and often more preoccupied with their own rivalries than with the larger geopolitical threats gathering beyond their borders. The Latin kingdoms were a shadow of their former strength, where Saladin represented a coherent, motivated civilization. The Crusader states reflected disunity and spiritual drift. In 1187, this imbalance came to a head at the Battle of Hattin. It was one of the most decisive military engagements in medieval history. Saladin lured the Christian army into the arid hills near Tiberias, exhausted, parched, and led by commanders more eager for glory than prudence. The Crusaders were encircled and annihilated. The true cross Christendom's most sacred reliquis captured. The military backbone of the Kingdom of Jerusalem was shattered. With its defenses obliterated, the holy city fell soon after. Jerusalem, the beating heart of the crusading dream, was once again under Muslim control. The shock in Europe was seismic. It rivaled the emotional upheaval of Pope Urban II's original call to arms. Suddenly, everything was in question. Had God abandoned them, or had they abandoned God? The response was swift and grand. What followed became known as the Third Crusade, also called the King's Crusade. It brought together 3 of the most powerful monarchs in Christendom: Frederick Barbarossa of the Holy Roman Empire, Philip Augustus of France, and Richard the Lionheart of England. Never before had so much royal authority converged on a single military expedition. It was the high water mark of medieval kingship, an extraordinary display of what Christian Europe could summon when its pride, fear, and faith were all on the line. And yet, even this unprecedented effort brought only partial success. Frederick Barbarossa, the grizzled veteran and most experienced of the 3, never made it to the Holy Land. While crossing a river in Anatolia, he drowned, possibly from a heart attack or stroke, leaving his massive army leaderless and demoralized. Many of his soldiers turned back. The expedition lost its cornerstone before it had even begun. Philip Augustus, always the politician, fulfilled a portion of his duty. He participated in the siege and capture of Acre, a vital port on the coast. But once the city fell, he quickly returned to France, concerned less with Jerusalem than with consolidating his power at home. Only Richard remained. The English king, famed for his valor and fierce temper, became the Crusades' principal actor. His campaign against Saladin was the stuff of legend. What unfolded between the two was more than a military campaign. It was a symbolic duel between 2 towering figures. each embodying different ideals of leadership, faith, and chivalry. Richard was the archetype of the feudal warrior king, courageous to the point of recklessness, passionate, magnanimous, and utterly consumed by the pursuit of military glory. Saladin, on the other hand, represented a different ethos, disciplined, culturally refined, combining political calculation with religious devotion. He was not only a warrior, but a statesman and a symbol of a more unified Islamic resistance. Contemporary chroniclers were fascinated by their dynamic. They spoke of mutual respect, of gifts exchanged and enemies honored. While extremists on both sides called for total war, Richard and Saladin offered glimpses of something else, an acknowledgement that even amidst war, respect for the enemy was possible. In 1192, the two leaders concluded a treaty. It was a pragmatic compromise. Christians would retain access to Jerusalem's holy sites, while sovereignty would remain with the Muslims. Richard would not capture Jerusalem, but the sacred pilgrimage routes were reopened. It was a truce born not of victory, but of realism. It might have formed the foundation for a new era of coexistence. But that vision was short-lived. The Fourth Crusade revealed just how far the crusading movement had drifted from its original purpose. Instead of striking at Muslim power, the Crusaders, manipulated by Venetian interests, diverted to Constantinople, the greatest Christian city in the world. In 1204, they sacked it with a brutality that shocked even their contemporaries. Churches were looted. Relics were sold in European markets. A Latin empire was imposed over a humiliated Orthodox population. It was Christians turning on Christians, and for many, it marked the moral death of the crusading ideal. Yet, despite the military failures and political betrayals, the broader impact of the Crusades was far more enduring and complex. The great movement of people, goods, and ideas between East and West stimulated cultural exchange on a scale Europe had never known. Merchants from Genoa, Venice, and Pisa established permanent trading posts in eastern ports, creating networks that would survive long after the last Crusader stronghold fell. These ports became gateways not just for spices, silk, and gold, but for knowledge. And that knowledge would change everything. European scholars came into contact with a vibrant Islamic intellectual tradition. Arabic medical texts, far superior to contemporary European understanding, revolutionized healthcare. Translations of Greek philosophy, preserved and enhanced by Muslim thinkers, introduced Aristotle to the West, laying the groundwork for the scholastic movement that would define the universities of the 13th century. The translation schools of Spain and Sicily became bridges between civilizations. There, Jewish, Christian, and Muslim scholars worked side by side. Mathematics, astronomy, and medicine all advanced dramatically. Without this infusion of knowledge, the later Renaissance would have been unthinkable. The Crusades also transformed Europe from within. Financing large military expeditions required innovations in banking and credit. Italian city-states like Florence, Genoa, and Venice developed sophisticated financial systems to support these ventures. Letters of credit, bills of exchange, and early forms of international banking began to take root. Legal systems evolved too. The privileges granted to crusaders, exemptions from taxes, protection of property, judicial immunity, contributed to the development of canon law and, eventually, international law. The Church's use of indulgences to incentivize participation would leave a legacy stretching far beyond the battlefield. Perhaps most significantly, the the Crusades forged a new European identity. For the first time since the reign of Charlemagne, Christians from every corner of Europe, Normans, Germans, Italians, Hungarians, Scots, saw themselves as part of a shared civilization. They had a common cause that transcended local rivalries and national interests. The idea of Christendom, one holy community under the spiritual authority of the Pope, reached its fullest expression in the crusading movement. Of course, this unity was always more symbolic than real. French and German crusaders frequently clashed. Italian merchants sold weapons to Muslim cities, even while funding Christian armies. Crusader nobles sometimes allied with Muslim leaders against rival Christian lords. The ideal of unity existed more in papal rhetoric than in battlefield reality. Yet the ideal endured. It provided Europe with a sense of collective identity, spiritual and political framework that would last long after the last Crusader kingdom fell. That ideal would shape medieval political theory. The Pope as the spiritual head of Christendom, the Holy Roman Emperor as its temporal protector. Even as Europe moved toward more fragmented national monarchies, the vision of a united Christian commonwealth remained a powerful myth. And yet, even as the crusading impulse persisted, it underwent a slow transformation. The 5th through 8th Crusades revealed a movement in decline, no longer driven by spontaneous religious fervor, but by calculated political maneuvering. When Frederick II negotiated the peaceful return of Jerusalem in 1229, many were outraged. A crusade without war, without bloodshed, it defied the entire mythology. Yet it also showed how flexibly and politicized the idea of holy war had become. Soon, crusades were being launched, not just against Muslims, but against fellow Christians. Heretics like the Cathars in southern France, pagans in the Baltic, enemies of the Pope in Italy. The scope of crusading expanded far beyond its original mission, becoming a tool of internal control as much as external conquest. By 1200, the Crusades had profoundly reshaped both Europe and the Islamic world. For Muslims, the Crusader threat forced unprecedented levels of political and military coordination. The concept of jihad, previously a relatively minor theme in Islamic jurisprudence, became central to Islamic identity. Leaders like Saladin and later the Mamluks framed their resistance as a divinely sanctioned struggle for survival. Islamic science, architecture, and scholarship flourished partly in response to the need to resist Western aggression. For Europe, the Crusades were both a triumph and a tragedy. A triumph in the sense that Europe had proven it could project power across continents, that its religion, politics, and military might could operate in unison, however briefly. A tragedy in that the same spiritual energy that built Gothic cathedrals and founded universities also led to massacres of Jews in the Rhineland, the sack of Constantinople, and centuries of mutual hatred. By the close of the 12th century, the age of the Great Crusades was ending. Christian control of the Holy Land could not be sustained. One by one, the Crusader strongholds fell until, finally, in 1291, the city of Acre was lost, and the last European outpost in the Levant vanished into history. The dream of a Latin Jerusalem was over, but its legacy was just beginning. Europe could no longer view the world as something distant and unknowable. Its borders had been pushed, its assumptions tested, its institutions transformed. The Church, once struggling for authority, now stood as a superpower. The knightly class, once a regional menace, now aspired to global crusades. The Western world had passed its first great test and emerged more powerful, more complex, and more dangerous. The Crusades were over, but their consequences would echo for centuries to come. Just as significant was the intellectual legacy of the Crusades in Spain, Sicily, and other zones of Muslim-Christian contact. European scholars encountered the sophisticated scientific, philosophical, and medical knowledge of the Islamic world. Greek texts, preserved and expanded upon by Arab thinkers, found their way back into European hands. The works of Aristotle, once nearly forgotten in the West, were now being studied, debated, and translated in centers of learning like Toledo and Palermo. This intellectual influx helped spark a cultural synthesis that would culminate in the rise of scholasticism, the rigorous, logic-driven school of thought that dominated medieval universities. And while religious war had been the catalyst, the result was a deeper and more nuanced understanding of theology, science, and human inquiry. The Crusades also shaped the internal evolution of Europe itself. Financing large-scale campaigns necessitated financial innovations, early forms of banking, letters of credit, and new tax systems, particularly in the Italian city-states that funded many of the expeditions. Legal privileges granted to crusaders led to important developments in canon law and laid early foundations for international legal norms. The system of indulgences, pioneered during this era, became a lasting fixture in Christian religious life, and later a point of fierce controversy. But perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Crusades was the forging of a European identity. For the first time since the days of Charlemagne, disparate kingdoms and peoples across the continent united around a shared religious and civilizational goal. From the forests of Ireland to the plains of Hungary, men took up the cross, not for national glory, but for a collective vision of Christendom's spiritual community that transcended borders. This vision was, of course, more aspirational than real. Rivalries persisted. Crusading armies from different regions often clashed with one another as much as with their enemies. Italian merchants sometimes sold supplies to Muslims even as they financed Christian knights. Political self-interest regularly undermined spiritual unity. Still, the idea of a Christian commonwealth, with the Pope as spiritual leader and the Holy Roman Emperor as secular head, provided a compelling ideological framework. Even as actual politics grew increasingly nationalistic, the concept of Europe as a unified Christian civilization took root and endured well beyond the fall of the last Crusader stronghold at Acre in 1291. Over time, the crusading impulse began to shift. No longer aimed exclusively at the Holy Land, it turned inward. Heretics in southern France, pagans in the Baltic, and even political enemies in Christian lands became targets of holy war. Frederick II, Holy Roman Emperor, stunned contemporaries by negotiating the peaceful handover of Jerusalem rather than conquering it. To many, this bloodless victory was a betrayal of crusading ideals. Yet it underscored how much the movement had changed from spiritual mission to political tool. By the end of the 13th century, the Crusades had left an indelible impact on both Christian and Muslim worlds. In the Islamic world, the threat of Christian conquest had forced greater unity and spurred military and administrative innovations. Jihad, once a minor religious concept, now played a central role in Muslim identity and resistance. Cultural achievements under the Ayyubid and Mamluk dynasties flourished, in part, because of their effort to match the vitality of the Christian West. In Europe, The Crusades represented both glory and tragedy. Glory in the sense of newfound confidence, and tragedy in the violence, fanaticism, and division they also inspired. The same spiritual energy that built the cathedrals of Chartres and Notre Dame also fueled massacres of Jewish communities and the plundering of Christian Byzantium. The Age of Faith had produced both light and shadow. As the 12th century came to a close, the grand era of Crusades was drawing to an end. The dream of Christian rule over the Holy Land had not been realized. Repeated defeats forced European powers to reassess not only their strategies but their spiritual assumptions. The idea that God guaranteed victory to the faithful had been shattered. And yet, the Europe that emerged from the crucible of the Crusades was fundamentally changed. The once isolated continent now projected its influence across 3 continents. The Catholic Church, once struggling to assert authority, now claimed power over kings and emperors. Knights who once preyed on their own peasants now dreamed of distant conquests. The foundations had been laid for Europe's next great transformation, a time of monarchies rising in power, of scholastic learning flourishing in universities, of merchant cities growing rich through global trade, but also a time of growing tensions, of deepening conflicts between church and state, of challenges that would eventually fracture the unity the Crusaders had once fought to preserve. The flames of Rome, once the eternal fire of the ancient world, flickered one final time before dimming into history. On a quiet September evening in the year 476 CE, as twilight descended like a curtain over the fading grandeur of an empire, a Germanic warlord named Odoacer stepped into the imperial palace of Ravenna. Marble walls still echoed with the ghosts of Emperors Augustus, Trajan, Hadrian, men whose names once thundered across continents. But the emperor who greeted Odoacer that night was not carved from such marble. He was a boy. Romulus Augustulus, mockingly nicknamed the Little Augustus, stood at just 16 years of age, barely more than a child. His reign had not stirred the world. It had passed like a sigh. Rome, once master of the known world, had become a puppet show, and Romulus, its final, tragic marionette. He ruled nothing of substance. No legions awaited his command. No senators trembled before his decrees. His authority, such as it was, existed only in form, not in force. The encounter was not a conquest in the usual sense. No swords clashed, no fires roared. Instead, Odoacer approached the young emperor with a solemnity that bordered on reverence. There was no cruelty, no triumphal sneer. Instead, the Gothic leader extended a kind of mercy. The imperial regalia, the cloak dyed purple, the scepter topped with eagle and cross, the diadem glittering with worn gemstones, was gently lifted from the boy's shoulders. One by one, these sacred relics were tucked into a chest, as if sealing away a dream. And then, Odoacer did something unheard of in the brutal annals of conquest. He did not seize the throne. He did not crown himself emperor. Instead, he sent the regalia eastward, across land and sea, to the Byzantine court in Constantinople. With it came a message to Emperor Zeno. The West needed no emperor any longer. There would be no replacement. Rome, at last, had fallen not with a scream, but with a whisper. Romulus Augustulus was quietly pensioned off to a villa in Campania to live out his days in obscurity. The empire he had briefly symbolized vanished like mist in morning sun. No grand edict marked the fall. No banner waved. No bell tolled. And yet, in that moment, the world turned. The ancient age, long trembling on the edge of dissolution, finally gave way. But to say Rome fell is to mistake an eclipse for a lightning strike. There was no singular collapse. Rather, there was unraveling. A long, slow fraying of threads that had once bound the world together. By 476 CE, the empire of Augustus, of Cicero, of Marcus Aurelius, was already a memory. What remained was a patchwork, Christian, rural, fragmented, surviving more on memory than muscle. Its armies, once the pride of iron discipline and Roman engineering, had become a coalition of Germanic mercenaries. Its cities, once vibrant hubs of philosophy, commerce, and art, were shrinking into silence. Its economy, once powered by Mediterranean trade and African grain, now hobbled along on local agriculture and tribute. Rome, the eternal city, still stood, but it stood more as a monument than a master. And so, what truly died in 476 was not an army or an emperor. It was the idea of unity, the illusion of a world governed by a single law, a single culture, a single sovereign power stretching from the green shores of Britannia to the sands of Egypt. That ideal had defined Rome for 1,000 years, and now, like smoke from an extinguished flame, it drifted into legend. Yet the so-called barbarians who stepped into the void were not destroyers. They were not strangers to Roman life. Many had been born inside the empire's borders. They had served in its legions, studied its law, and learned its language. They dreamed not of burning Rome, but of becoming it. For them, conquest was not desecration, it was inheritance. The Visigoths, once feared as plunderers, now ruled over Spain and southern Gaul. The Vandals, who had crossed from Iberia to Africa, made Carthage their capital, and created a navy that dominated the western Mediterranean. And in Italy, the Ostrogoths took the reins, led by a man who straddled two worlds, Theodoric the Great. Theodoric was born into Gothic nobility, yet raised as a hostage in the court of Constantinople. There, amidst golden domes and imperial scholars, he absorbed Roman ideas like water into thirsty soil. He returned west not merely as a warrior, but as a man of vision. He could not read or write in the classical sense, but he ruled with a sense of Roman dignity. His reign marked a strange resurrection, not of the empire, but of its spirit. Under Theodoric, Italy found a fragile peace. Roman officials continued their duties. The Roman Senate, though now symbolic, still met beneath the gaze of statues. Aqueducts flowed, roads were patrolled, churches were repaired, and laws were enforced, two sets of them, in fact, one for Romans, one for Goths. In this dual structure, Theodoric forged a kind of multicultural harmony, a balance that few after him would manage. But even Theodoric could not halt the deeper decline. Urban life, once the crown jewel of Roman civilization, continued its retreat. Without imperial grain fleets, commerce collapsed. Artisans fled. Literacy waned. The great cities that had once echoed with the rhetoric of senators and the laughter of children shrank into walled towns. Rome itself, once home to over 1 million souls, dwindled to 1/10 of that. Into this silence, a new power stepped forward, not of legions or emperors, but of scripture and sanctuary. The Christian Church, which had once been persecuted by emperors, now became the custodian of civilization. In the absence of lawgivers and governors, bishops assumed the mantle of leadership. They mediated disputes, fed the poor, and preserved what little learning remained. One such figure rose to prominence in the chaos: Pope Leo the Great. When Attila the Hun approached Rome in 452, Leo rode out to meet him. What passed between them is lost to history, but the result is known. Attila turned away. For the first time, a pope had defended the city, not with swords, but with faith. It was the birth of a new kind of authorities, spiritual, moral, enduring. And this authority grew. A century later, Pope Gregory the Great took the reins of a crumbling Rome and steered it toward transformation. He organized relief for famine, defended the city from the Lombards, and reorganized church administration. But his most lasting legacy was his vision of a Christian Europe. In 597, he sent the monk Augustine to the distant shores of England, planting the seeds of faith in the pagan north. Gregory was not trying to revive the Roman Empire. He was trying to replace it. Where emperors had ruled with might, he would rule with mercy. Where Roman legions had conquered, Christian missionaries would convert. A spiritual empire, woven from prayer and penance, would rise from the ruins. Meanwhile, far to the east, the Eastern Roman Empire still stood untouched by Gothic wars, steeped in Byzantine splendor. In Constantinople, Emperor Justinian watched the Western kingdoms not as heirs, but as impostors. He believed he alone held the legacy of Rome, and he resolved to reclaim the West. In 533, he launched his reconquest. His general, Belisarius, crushed the Vandals in North Africa with surgical precision. Next came Italy, but the Gothic wars, once begun, became a slow-burning tragedy. For nearly 20 years, the peninsula was torn apart. Battles raged across ruined cities. Crops failed. People fled. Theodoric's fragile harmony was shattered. By the end, Byzantine banners again flew over Ravenna. But the victory was hollow. Italy was devastated. The Ostrogothic kingdom, with its delicate balance of Roman and Gothic order, was no more. In trying to revive the empire, Justinian had unwittingly completed its dismantling. And into the ruins came the Lombards, another Germanic tribe, fierce and unfamiliar. They swept into the north of Italy, carving out new duchies. The Byzantines clung to a few cities and coastlines, but the dream of Roman unity was lost once more. From the Pyrenees to the Rhine, from the Alps to the Irish Sea, a new Europe was forming, fragmented, localized, and profoundly transformed. Trade routes shrank to regional paths. Gold coins vanished, replaced by barter. Latin faded, replaced by local tongues. And yet, something new stirred beneath the surface. In Irish monasteries, monks copied ancient texts by candlelight: Homer, Virgil, Cicero, saving the voices of the classical world. In the courts of Frankish kings, Roman ideas mingled with Germanic customs to form new styles of governance. Across this patchwork, the Church served as the one thread of continuity, a bridge between the past and the future. So when we speak of the fall of Rome, we must not imagine a single cataclysm. It was not a curtain dropping, but a slow dimming of the lights. It was not the end of civilization, but a metamorphosis, painful, incomplete, but ultimately generative. From the ruins of marble temples and broken aqueducts, a new world would rise. Not Rome reborn, but something different, something rooted in faith, feudal ties, and forgotten frontiers. A medieval world, not yet dark, not yet light, but quietly gathering its strength beneath the stars. And so we leave behind the final boy emperor, the warlords, the popes, and the emperors. We step forward into a world still healing, still searching. Rome had died, but the idea of Rome, its order, its ambition, its dream of unity, lived on, scattered like seeds into the fertile soil of a waiting age. The fire that once blazed from the heart of Rome had long since dimmed to embers, and on a hushed September evening in the year 476, as the Adriatic breeze whispered through the withering cypress trees around Ravenna, the last shimmer of that ancient flame quietly flickered out. A boy stood in the imperial palace, not a conqueror, not a Caesar, just a quiet shadow of an empire now crumbling under the weight of centuries. His name was Romulus Augustulus. Even his name was a ghost Romulus, the legendary founder of Rome, Augustus, the empire's first emperor. Yet the boy himself was neither founder nor ruler in truth. Just 16 years old, slight of frame and soul, his authority extended no further than the cloistered marble corridors around him. The empire that crowned him had already slipped through the cracks. Into that palace stepped Odoacer, a Germanic chieftain turned Roman general, his footsteps echoing like the toll of iron on hollow stone. No swords were drawn, no trumpets sounded. History's final chapter in the Western Roman Empire would not be written in blood, but in silence. Odoacer was not a barbarian in the way old Roman tales had painted them. He had fought for Rome, worn her armor, spoke her tongue, and now, standing before the child emperor, he reached out not with cruelty, but with solemn purpose. With quiet dignity, he removed the imperial insignia, the diadem, the purple cloak, the scepter once held by emperors who had ruled from Hadrian to Theodosius. One by one, he folded them away. He then sent them eastward across mountains and seas to Constantinople, the new Rome that still shone along the Bosporus. With them went a message. There would be no new emperor in the West. The line was ended. And so the boy, Romulus Augustulus, was pensioned off, not slain, not exiled, just gently erased, given a villa in Campania, a quiet corner of the world to grow old and forgotten. History closed the book, and the page curled inward. But what had truly ended that day? Not the city of Rome still standing, albeit hollowed and weary. Not Roman culture, it would echo through law, architecture, and language for millennia to come. No, what ended that day was an idea. The idea that one ruler could bind together all the lands from Britannia to the Nile under a single banner, one law, one empire, stretching unbroken through time. What died was unity, and what was born in its place would be something messier, darker, more fragmented, but not without beauty of its own. From the wreckage of empire, a new Europe would grow. It's tempting to think of Rome's fall as a sudden collapse, cataclysm, a sacking, a civilization reduced to ruins overnight. But the truth is gentler and stranger. Rome did not fall like a pillar in a storm. It bent, it shifted, it changed shape, quietly, over generations. By the 5th century, the Rome of Julius Caesar was already gone in spirit. The old marble forums echoed with silence. The temples stood unused. The armies that guarded the empire's vast frontiers were no longer Roman-born legionaries, but Germanic mercenaries, men who had grown up beyond the Rhine, who fought for Roman gold and wore Roman eagles, but dreamed in another tongue. The cities that had once pulsed with commerce were shrinking. Trade routes narrowed, and with them the flow of coins and silks and spices. Wealth turned inward. Nobles retreated to their villas in the countryside. The old urban heart was withering. Even the empire's faith had changed. Once pagan, Rome had become a Christian world, its gods abandoned, its churches rising like solemn sentinels over crumbling shrines. Christianity brought new values, new rhythms, new powers. The church began to fill the void the emperors left behind, and those called barbarians. They were no longer strangers storming the gates. They were insiders, leaders, officers, even senators, men who wore togas over chainmail, who spoke Latin in the Senate and Gothic in the camp. They didn't want to destroy Rome, they wanted to inherit her. The Visigoths settled in Gaul and Spain. The Vandals crossed to North Africa, capturing Carthage, once Rome's fiercest rival. The Franks held sway in northern Gaul, and in Italy, power fell to the Ostrogoths under a leader who stood with one foot in two worlds, Theodoric the Great. Theodoric was born a Goth, but raised in Constantinople as a hostage part of a political bargain. In the marble halls of the Eastern Roman court, he learned Roman customs, studied Latin texts, and moved through ceremony and diplomacy like a native. He could barely write, but he knew how to rule. When he returned west to conquer Italy, he did not come to shatter Rome's legacy, but to guard it. Under Theodoric, the Roman Senate still met. Roman law still governed Roman citizens. The great aqueducts still flowed. Gothic warriors stood alongside Roman administrators, two cultures bound together in uneasy but functional alliance. It was a strange, shimmering moment, a final echo of Rome that wasn't truly Rome anymore. The cities breathed again. Roads were patrolled. Art and architecture found patrons once more. For a generation, it seemed as if something might survive, but it could not last. The deeper currents of change ran too strong. The old structures of empire, its bureaucracy, its long-distance economy, its intricate social networks were breaking apart. The cities continued to shrink. Literacy waned, schools closed, trade withered. And in this growing silence, a new power rose not from emperors or kings, but from bishops. The Christian Church had long been entwined with Rome. Since Constantine's conversion, it had grown in influence, binding together people of all tongues and provinces in shared faith. But now, with secular authority disintegrating, the Church became more than a spiritual guide, became the spine of the world. Bishops became governors in all but name. They organized defenses when cities were threatened. They negotiated with warlords. They administered charity and law. In a world where the imperial system was collapsing, they offered continuity. One moment, above all, signaled this shift. In 452, Attila the Hun, called the Scourge of God, approached Rome. The legions were gone. The emperors were impotent. And yet the city was spared, not by arms, but by words. Pope Leo the Great rode out to meet Attila, and somehow, through faith, diplomacy, or fear, the Hunnic king turned back. It was a miracle. It was a signal. From then on, popes were not merely shepherds of souls. They were defenders of cities. They were power brokers in a world without emperors. And in time, they would dream not of the old empire, but of a new one not built with legions, but with parchment and prayer. That dream would take root in the mind of Gregory the Great. Born into a senatorial family, Gregory witnessed firsthand the decay of the Roman order. When he became pope in 590, he did not wait for help from Constantinople. Rome was his to govern now. He repaired aqueducts, he fed the poor, he organized militias, and he sent missionaries. In 597, he dispatched a quiet monk named Augustine to the misty isles of Britannia. the mission to convert the pagan Anglo-Saxons and plant the seeds of a Christian Europe. It was a vision not of imperial restoration, but spiritual unification. If the Roman Empire was gone in body, perhaps it could live again in soul. But far to the east, in the shining city of Constantinople, one emperor still believed in the old dream, Justinian. To him, the barbarians were not partners or heirs. They were traitors, usurpers, pretenders, and he would reclaim what had been lost. In 533, he sent his general Belisarius to strike at the Vandals in North Africa. The campaign was swift, brilliant a triumph. Carthage fell. The Roman banners flew once more. Then came Italy. The Gothic wars followed 2 decades of bitter fighting. Cities besieged, populations slaughtered, fields burned. Rome itself was sacked again and again. What Theodoric had preserved, Justinian shattered in the name of salvation. And in the end, yes, the Eastern Empire held Italy, but it was a shell, a ruin. The population halved, the countryside lawless. The dream of Rome, reclaimed at such a cost, now lay in dust. Into this broken land came new invaders, the Lombards, fierce, pagan, unfamiliar. They took what they could and held it. Italy would now be a battleground for centuries, a patchwork of dukedoms and rivals, of popes and kings, each claiming pieces of the fallen crown. And so, by the 7th century, the map of Europe had changed beyond recognition. The old provinces were gone. Trade flowed no more along Roman roads, but across muddy rivers and mountain passes. Literacy flickered only in monasteries, where monks, hunched over vellum by candlelight, preserved the words of Cicero, Virgil, and Augustine. Law was no longer codified in imperial scrolls, but spoken from memory, rooted in blood ties and tribal customs. Justice became personal, not procedural. And yet, even amid the quiet collapse, life went on. Children were born, songs were sung, fields were plowed, people adapted. In Ireland, far from the reach of empire, a new monastic culture flourished. Illuminated manuscripts, ornate metalwork, a light in the long night. In the Frankish courts of Gaul, kings emerged who fused Roman ideas with Germanic traditions. A new world was being born, not as a mirror of Rome, but as something different, something medieval. The fall of Rome, then, was not an end. It was a transformation. The city that once ruled the world had passed into legend, but from its ashes rose a new civilization, forged in faith, memory, and migration, not united, but diverse, not imperial, but spiritual. And in the quiet corners of candlelit monasteries and the smoky halls of wooden palaces, a new chapter was beginning. The Middle Ages had arrived, not with a roar, but with a whisper. The flames of Rome, which had flickered for more than 1,000 years, were finally dying out. On a dusky September evening in 476 CE, a Germanic warlord named Odoacer stepped into the imperial palace at Ravenna. The sound of his boots echoed through once sacred marble halls that had quaked beneath the voice of Caesar Augustus himself. But the emperor who greeted him was no Augustus. He was a boy. Romulus, Augustulus, mockingly called the little emperor, even by his own advisors, was just 16. A powerless puppet caught in a game he never understood. What happened next was quiet, almost ceremonial, yet resounded like the final toll of a funeral bell. Odoacer, who had once served Rome faithfully as a mercenary, approached the boy not with violence, but with dignity. He gently removed the imperial cloak from his shoulders, collected the diadem, the scepter, and the golden ornaments worn by emperors since Constantine, and placed them into a chest. Then he did the unthinkable. Odoacer sent the imperial regalia eastward to Constantinople, along with a message. The Western Roman Empire no longer needed an emperor. No blood was shed, no crowd gathered. Romulus Augustulus was quietly pensioned off to a villa in Campania, where he would live out his life as a historical footnote. But what ended that day was not just a boy's reign or a Roman dynasty. In that quiet surrender, the ancient world itself took its final breath. And before we call it the fall of Rome, we must first understand what truly died and what was born in its place. The Roman Empire didn't collapse like a toppled column in an earthquake. It changed shape, evolved, fragmented, and reformed over centuries. By the time 476 arrived, the Rome of Augustus or Marcus Aurelius was already long gone. The empire had become deeply Christian, increasingly rural, and largely decentralized. Its military, predominantly Germanic, its economy, centered around agriculture, its cities, shrinking and struggling. The so-called barbarians who inherited the empire weren't wild destroyers. They were seasoned soldiers, trained administrators, and ambitious leaders who had spent generations immersed in Roman ways. They spoke Latin, studied Roman law, and dreamed of Roman glory. They didn't want to burn the empire to the ground. They wanted to own it. They wanted to wear the purple and continue the legacy. They weren't tearing down Rome. They were trying to become it. But despite their efforts, something vanished forever. In 476, the idea of unity. For 1,000 years, Rome had symbolized one empire, one law, one ruler, stretching from the misty shores of Britain to the burning sands of Mesopotamia. That grand vision shattered. In its place rose a Europe of fragments, each piece a shadow of the Roman whole, striving to reclaim what was lost in miniature. After Romulus Augustulus vanished from the stage, the Western world didn't descend into chaos overnight. Rather, it became a quilt of kingdoms, each led by former outsiders. The Visigoths ruled over Spain and parts of southern Gaul. The Vandals made their capital in Carthage and dominated North Africa. In Italy, the Ostrogoths took power under a man who perfectly embodied this strange new world. Theodoric the Great. Theodoric was a paradox. Raised as a hostage in the court of Constantinople, he was steeped in Roman culture, literature, and law. He could trace his signature with a golden stencil, but may not have been able to read what he was signing. His government was a fascinating hybrid-Roman ceremony. Roman officials, even the Roman Senate, continued to function. But at its core, Theodoric's power relied on Gothic warriors who valued horses and swords far more than land titles or coins. And yet, under his rule, Italy saw a golden moment, perhaps its last for many centuries. Aqueducts flowed again. Roads remained passable. Trade routes were guarded. Roman laws still applied to Roman citizens, while Gothic laws governed the Ostrogoths. Two parallel legal systems, coexisting under a single crowning early vision of what we might now call multiculturalism. Still, stability could not reverse the deeper unraveling. The cities, the beating heart of classical civilization, continued to fade. As long-distance trade withered and imperial support vanished, people left urban centers for the countryside. Rome itself, once home to over 1 million people, had dwindled to perhaps 50,000 by the year 500. The empire was retreating, not just militarily, but socially, economically, and culturally. And into that vacuum stepped a different kind of power, the Christian Church. Christianity had been gaining momentum ever since Constantine's dramatic conversion in the early 4th century. But as emperors faded and governors disappeared, bishops rose. They didn't just preach, they ruled. They distributed food to the hungry, negotiated with barbarian warlords, and preserved the embers of literacy and learning. In 452, Pope Leo the Great confronted Attila the Hun outside the gates of Rome. With nothing but words and faith, he convinced the scourge of God to turn back. It was a turning point. From then on, popes didn't just guide souls, they commanded cities. They claimed that the Bishop of Rome had supremacy over all Christian churches, and by extension, over Christian kings. This growing authority came into full bloom under Pope Gregory the Great, who led from 590 to 604. With Rome's civil government crumbling, Gregory stepped into the role of mayor, general, and diplomat. He organized defenses, oversaw grain distribution, and negotiated with invading Lombards. But perhaps his most lasting legacy was his missionary vision. Gregory wasn't trying to revive the Roman Empire as it once was. He imagined something new, a spiritual empire. In 597, he sent Augustine, not the theologian, but a missionary monk, to England, planting the seeds of a Christian Europe. This wasn't nostalgia, it was transformation. Gregory understood that power had shifted from emperors to bishops, from marble palaces to monastery walls. Meanwhile, the Eastern Roman Empire still stood, watching from afar. In Constantinople, Emperor Justinian viewed the Western kingdoms not as successors, but as usurpers. He believed he was the one true heir of Augustus and Constantine, and he wanted to reclaim what had been lost. In 533, he made his move. His general Belisarius swiftly crushed the Vandal kingdom in North Africa. Then he turned to Italy, launching what would become the devastating Gothic Wars. For nearly 2 decades, the peninsula became a battlefield. Cities burned, fields were trampled, and the population may have been cut in half. At the end of it all, Justinian had technically won. Roman banners once again flew over Ravenna and Carthage. But what remained was a hollow shell. Italy was ruined. The Ostrogothic kingdom that had preserved so much Roman tradition was gone, replaced by a distant administration in Constantinople that could barely maintain control. In trying to rebuild the empire, Justinian had finished the work of dismantling it. Theodoric's Italia, land of order and cautious coexistence, was replaced by devastation. And into that ruin stepped a new wave of conquerors, the Lombards. By the close of the 6th century, Western Europe looked nothing like the grand empire that had once spanned continents. Trade had shrunk to local exchanges. Cities became fortresses. Written culture survived only in monasteries. Roman law gave way to simpler, more personal justice systems, rooted in Germanic tradition and Christian morality. But this wasn't the end. It was a metamorphosis. In Irish monasteries, monks meticulously copied classical manuscripts, preserving the legacy of Greek and Roman thought. In the courts of Frankish kings, new models of rule were emerging, hybrids of Roman bureaucracy and Germanic leadership. The fall of Rome was not just a collapse. It was a transformation that laid the foundation for something new. From these broken pieces, medieval Europe would rise, not as a shadow of the past, but as a world of its own, forged in the fires of faith, migration, and memory. The medieval papacy stood as a bastion of traditional authority, asserting that all earthly power derived from a higher spiritual source and consequently remained under the Church's moral jurisdiction. This was not merely a theological stance, it was a political doctrine, a way of framing human governance as subordinate to divine law, channeled through the institution of the Church. The papacy had never accepted that kings or emperors could rule without reference to the spiritual authority that only it claimed to possess. This belief system clashed profoundly with the ambitions of secular rulers, none more dramatically than with Emperor Frederick II. Frederick was a man of dazzling intellect and ruthless ambition, a ruler who embodied the complexity of his era. He was crowned Holy Roman Emperor in 1220, inheritor of an office that still bore the echoes of ancient Rome and the universal dreams of Charlemagne. Yet Frederick was also King of Sicily, a land with its own distinct culture, economy, and political dynamics. Frederick's court in Palermo was as renowned for its philosophical debate as it was for administrative innovation. His long conflict with the papacy was as much ideological as it was military. The Pope viewed him as a dangerous heretic, a ruler who sought to place himself above spiritual scrutiny. Frederick, for his part, saw the Church as an obstacle to imperial renewal, a bloated institution clinging to outdated privileges. Yet his eventual downfall was not precipitated by papal curses or theological excommunication. It was, more than anything, a matter of resources. The war against the papacies, stretched across decades, had become a strain even Frederick's considerable administrative machinery could not bear. Despite his control over both the Kingdom of Germany and the wealthy lands of Sicily, Frederick's resources were ultimately finite, waging war against coalitions that included not only the papal armies, but also the might of France, the involvement of England. To make matters worse, during Frederick's reign, Eastern Europe faced the terrifying onslaught of the Mongol invasions. These incursions diverted imperial attention and drained financial resources at precisely the moment when a concentrated effort against papal forces might have turned the tide decisively in Frederick's favor. When Frederick died in 1250, his imperial dream died with him. What followed was not the crowning of a successor, but a great vacuum, the interregnum. For 23 long years, the Holy Roman Empire had no emperor recognized across its vast territories. This unprecedented gap marked the true end of any hope for a universal Christian monarchy in the West. When a new ruler was finally elected in 1273, it was Rudolf of Habsburger regional power broker rather than a world emperor. His title was more symbolic than real. From that moment forward, the Holy Roman Empire continued in name. By the beginning of the 14th century, the political structure of Europe had been fundamentally redefined. The medieval dream of universal authority embodied in both emperor and pope had been dismantled, replaced by rising national monarchies asserting their own jurisdictional supremacy. Kings no longer viewed themselves as vassals of the Church or beholden to imperial oversight. Instead, they laid claim to divine right and sovereign independence within their own realms. England, for example, had developed a constitutional tradition that placed legal limits on royal authority. The Magna Carta of 1215, initially a peace treaty between a beleaguered King John and his rebellious barons, had become the seed of a broader legal culture. By 1300, English kings ruled in partnership with a nascent parliament, a body that, though still dominated by the nobility, represented a departure from absolute monarchy. Meanwhile, in France, a different model emerged. There, the monarchy concentrated power in royal hands through an expanding bureaucracy. The Capetian kings extended their influence beyond their ancestral lands, building a centralized state with professional administrators and a standing army that owed its allegiance directly to the crown. Germany, in stark contrast, fragmented. The imperial title had become almost entirely ceremonial, wielded by a figure who held little real authority beyond his hereditary lands. Local dukes, bishops, and counts governed autonomously, often acting as petty monarchs in their own right. Political unity in the German lands would not be achieved until the 19th century. This political splintering had profound cultural and social effects. The weakening of imperial power meant that local identities grew stronger, legal systems diverged, economic development became uneven. Yet, amidst the fragmentation, new social classes were rising classes that would shape Europe's future. Though lacking noble blood, possessed the literacy and bureaucratic skills to serve in the growing apparatus of the state. Universities, some founded only a century earlier, began churning out lawyers, clerks, theologians, and administrators. These individuals formed a kind of proto-bourgeoisie, professional middle class, increasingly vital to royal governance. The development of national legal systems further solidified this trend. Kings established royal courts that enforced standardized laws across their territories, undermining the patchwork of feudal customs and noble privileges that had long defined medieval justice. Alongside legal innovation came financial transformation. The demands of governance, warfare, and infrastructure required sophisticated systems of taxation and record-keeping. This in turn stimulated the growth of banking institutions and commercial networks. Italian banking houses operated across Europe. New forms of credit and exchange made it possible for monarchies to fund large-scale projects. But the same royal authority that enabled these transformations also bred new dangers. With their expanded resources and centralized power, national monarchies could now wage wars on a scale previously unimaginable. The old conflicts of the medieval world, limited skirmishes over feudal rights or dynastic claims, were being replaced by larger, more destructive contests. Many of these conflicts arose from the arbitrary and often absurdly convoluted map of Europe's political geography. English monarchs claimed lands in France by virtue of ancestral inheritance, creating tensions that would ignite the 100 Years' War. German rulers retained interests in northern Italy, even as their influence waned. The Papal States carved a strange ecclesiastical realm out of central Italy, often at odds with both emperor and local princes. These tangled claims became the fuel for continent-spanning wars, while the weakening of international institutions meant there were fewer mechanisms to resolve disputes peacefully. Papal diplomacy, once a powerful tool for maintaining peace among Christian rulers, grew increasingly ineffective. As national monarchs gained confidence and resources, they felt less need to heed the Pope's call for moderation. The once sacrosanct moral authority of the Church no longer served as a check on secular ambition. At the same time, imperial power had all but vanished from Central Europe, leaving a political vacuum that French kings increasingly sought to fill. This was a new Europe, wealthier, better governed, more dynamic than the feudal order that preceded it. But it was also more unstable. The same centralization and institutional growth that made monarchies more effective also made them more dangerous. And so, Europe entered the 14th century not in decline, but on the precipice of a transformation. This century would not be defined by triumph, but by catastrophe. It would witness a convergence of crisis war, plague, religious schism that would test every institution of the High Middle Ages. It would see the death of medieval optimism and the birth of modern complexity. The storm began not with the plague, but with famine. The so-called medieval warm period, which had supported agricultural expansion since the 10th century, came to an end. Cooler, wetter conditions gripped Europe, leading to a string of failed harvests. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1322 was the first pan-European demographic disaster in centuries. Millions starved. Chroniclers tell of mothers selling their children for bread, of cannibalism in the remote countryside, of criminals released from prison simply because there was no food to sustain them. In some areas, wolves returned to scavenge the bodies of the dead, emboldened by the absence of human resistance. These were not isolated tragedies. They revealed the fundamental fragility of medieval society. The agricultural techniques that had supported population growth for centuries, three-field rotation, heavy plows, expanded cultivation, could not adapt to the new climate. Commerce shriveled as transportation networks failed and surplus vanished. Lords, once seen as protectors in return for peasant loyalty, found themselves powerless to aid their vassals. The old feudal bonds began to dissolve, just as Europe was beginning a slow, painful recovery. Disaster struck again, this time with a swiftness and fury unmatched in recorded history. The plague that would become known as the Black Death originated in the rodent populations of Central Asia. It had long simmered in the steppes, a regional affliction. But the expansion of the Mongol Empire created a vast network of trade and conquest that inadvertently carried infected fleas westward. The disease followed the Silk Road from China to the Black Sea. From there, Genoese merchant ships carried it into the Mediterranean. The first outbreak in Europe was recorded in 1347, when 12 Genoese galleys limped into the Sicilian port of Messina. Their crews were dying, covered in black, blood-oozing boils. Within days, the disease spread to the city. From Messina, it traveled north and west through Marseille, Venice, and Constantinople. By 1349, the Black Death had reached every corner of the continent. It killed with terrifying efficiency. In some cities, over half the population died in a matter of weeks. Entire villages vanished. In England alone, the population plummeted from nearly 4 million to around 2.5 million. The symptoms were horrifying. Buboes, swollen lymph nodes, blackened with internal bleeding. Victims often died within days. Worse still were the pneumonic and septicemic forms, which spread through coughing and direct contact, killing even more quickly. Medicine offered no answers. Priests could not explain God's wrath. Entire communities turned to despair. Yet, in the wreckage, something new began to stir. Just as the famine had shattered the old economic systems, the plague forced Europeans to reimagine social relationships, labor, governance, and even the nature of divine justice. Out of the destruction came Chanja, harsh, transformative crucible from which a new world would slowly, painfully emerge. The flames of Rome, once radiant and unshakable, were now flickering low, dimmed by centuries of internal decay and external strain. And on a hushed evening in the year 476 CE, that great flame gave one last quiet gasp before surrendering to the night. In the quiet city of Ravenna, nestled in the marshlands of northern Italy, a Germanic warlord named Odoacer made his way through the marble halls of the imperial palace. These were not just halls of stone and sculpture. They echoed with the memories of triumphs and tragedies, of emperors crowned and conspiracies born. And now silence lingered there, heavy and ancient. Awaiting Odoacer was not a mighty Caesar clad in purple and gold. There was no crowd of senators, no legions lined in ceremonial salute. Instead, seated on the throne of the West was a mere boy. Romulus Augustulus, scarcely 16, had worn the imperial purple not with power but as a costume draped upon a puppet. He had not conquered nor commanded. He had been placed there by his father, a usurper, and tolerated by generals only because he posed no threat. What followed was not dramatic. No swords clashed, no shouts of rebellion echoed. Odoacer approached, not as a conqueror, but as a man fulfilling something inevitable. Gently, solemnly, he removed the trappings of empire from the boy, first the cloak, then the diadem, and finally the scepter that for centuries had symbolized dominion over the known world. These objects, radiant with imperial memory, were placed into a chest. Odoacer sent them eastward to Constantinople, along with a message to the Emperor Zeno. The Western Empire no longer required an emperor of its own. There would be no more Caesars in the West. Romulus Augustulus was not harmed. There was no need. He was given a villa in Campania, a quiet pension, and was allowed to disappear into the mists of history. No one knew then that he would become the final name on a list that stretched back to Augustus, the final flicker of an empire that had once reshaped the world. But what truly ended on that quiet September evening? Was it merely a boy's reign, or was it the last breath of the ancient world itself? To answer that, we must look deeper. For Rome did not die like a man struck down in battle. It faded like a monument worn by rain. Its details softened, its edges blurred, until the shape remained, but the essence was changed. The empire had been evolving for centuries, not collapsing. By 476, it bore little resemblance to the Rome of Augustus or Marcus Aurelius. The legions were filled with Germanic warriors. The cities had shrunk, their marble facades crumbling. Commerce had slowed to a trickle. Latin endured, but fewer people could write it. Christianity had transformed from persecuted sect to the soul of the empire. Indeed, even those who dismantled the empire did so not with rage, but with reverence. The so-called barbarians, the Goths, the Vandals, the Franks did not see themselves as destroyers. They were inheritors. They spoke Latin, studied Roman law, and aspired not to replace Rome, but to become it. In the years that followed the abdication of Romulus Augustulus, the West fractured into a patchwork of new kingdoms. But these were not born in a vacuum. They were layered atop the old Roman skeleton. The Visigoths ruled Spain and parts of Gaul. The Vandals established a North African kingdom, making Carthage their capital. And in Italy, Odoacer declared himself ruler, not emperor, but king, a Germanic title over Roman lands. Yet perhaps the most striking of these new rulers was Theodoric the Great, king of the Ostrogoths. A man of paradoxes, Theodoric had spent his youth as a hostage in Constantinople, absorbing Roman customs, Greek learning, and the subtle rituals of imperial life. Though a warrior by blood, he was shaped in the marble halls of Byzantium. When he seized control of Italy, he did so not to erase its traditions, but to preserve them. Under his rule, Italy experienced a fragile renaissance. Aqueducts ran again. Roman senators debated once more in their half-empty chamber. Schools reopened, and trade, though modest, resumed. Roman citizens were governed by Roman law, Goths by their own, two systems coexisting under a single ruler. Theodoric ruled not from fear but from respect. He dressed like a Roman, consulted Roman advisors, and kept Latin as the language of administration. Yet his army remained Gothic, and the real power behind the facade lay with the sword, not the pen. His Italy was a land of careful balance, of coexistence, not unity. But despite Theodoric's best efforts, the deeper forces unraveling the Roman world could not be reversed. Urban life, so central to classical civilization, continued to wither. With the collapse of long-distance trade and the withdrawal of imperial infrastructure, cities no longer thrived. The great metropolises of the past, Carthage, Milan, Arles, shrunk into fortified towns. Rome, once a city of over 1 million souls, had dwindled to a few tens of thousands by the year 500. Weeds grew between broken columns. Amphitheaters stood silent, their arches haunted by the past. And as the physical structures of empire faded, new powers stepped into the void. Foremost among them was the Christian Church. Once a persecuted sect hidden in catacombs, it had now emerged as the sole institution capable of holding society together. Bishops did not merely lead prayers, they led communities. They negotiated peace with invaders, distributed food during famine, and upheld a fragile order when secular rulers fell short. One such bishop was Leo the Great. In 452, when the terrifying specter of Attila the Hun threatened Rome, it was Leo, not a general, who rode out to meet him. Legend says that Attila turned back after this encounter, though the reasons remain mysterious. But the symbolism was clear. The Pope, not the Emperor, now stood as Rome's guardian. This transformation reached new heights under Pope Gregory the Great, who ruled from 590 to 604. A former monk, Gregory inherited a city in chaos, plagued by famine, floods, and Lombard raids. With no functional government remaining, Gregory became not just a religious leader, but Rome's administrator. He oversaw grain distribution, organized defenses, and managed civic affairs. Yet Gregory's greatest ambition was not administrative, was spiritual. He saw in Christianity not just salvation, but a unifying force for a fragmented Europe. In 597, he sent a mission to the Anglo-Saxons, led by Augustine of Canterbury. These missionaries would go on to convert the kingdoms of Britain, laying the foundations of Christendom. Gregory's vision was clear. If Rome could no longer rule by the sword, it would lead through the soul. While the Western world reshaped itself in monasteries and churches, the Eastern Roman Empire watched with growing unease. Constantinople, still resplendent with mosaics and marble, considered itself the rightful heir of Rome, and one emperor, Justinian I, resolved to reclaim the lost provinces of the West, not in name only, but in fact. In 533, he sent his general Belisarius to North Africa. The Vandal kingdom fell swiftly. Italy came next, but here the dream soured. The Gothic Wars, which raged from 535 to 554, devastated the peninsula. Cities were sacked and resacked. Fields were salted or abandoned. The population may have been halved. Belisarius won battles, but Italy lost itself. When the dust settled, Italy was nominally back under Roman rule. But this was a ghost of the old empire. Ravenna flew the imperial standard again, but trade had vanished. Roads crumbled, and local elites had either died or fled. Justinian had reconquered the land, but not the legacy. And into this weakened Italy marched a new people, the Lombards. Germanic, pagan at first, and opportunistic, they carved out duchies across the land. Rome held on only because of the Church. In time, even the papacy sought new allies, turning its gaze away from Constantinople and toward the rising power of the Franks. By the close of the 6th century, the transformation was nearly complete. The Western Roman Empire, as a political structure, was gone. But the world it had shaped did not vanish. Its ruins became foundations. Its language, law, and faith lingered. And in this strange twilight, something new began to stir. In the misty hills of Ireland, far from imperial roads, monks copied Latin texts with aching precision. They preserved Virgil, Cicero, Augustine not for glory, but for God. In the courts of the Franks, kings began to blend Roman administration with Germanic customs. In Spain, Visigothic bishops compiled councils in Toledo, merging canon law with civil governance. The ancient world had not died, it had metamorphosed. The empire's body was buried, but its spirit passed into new vessels. And from these fragments monasteries, manor houses, chapels, and castle walls would one day rise a new civilization. One not born of marble columns and imperial eagles, but of parchment, prayer, and plough. This was not the end. It was a beginning. The storm that came to define the 14th century began not with thunder, but with a whisper of return. After nearly 7 decades away from its ancient home, the papacy made its way back to Rome in 1377. Pope Gregory XI, resolute and weary, abandoned the luxurious but isolating courts of Avignon and led the Holy See back to the Eternal City. To the Romans, the return was not merely a symbolic gesture, was a restoration, a long-awaited homecoming that rekindled pride and hope in the Italian heartland. The air was thick with anticipation, as if the very stones of Rome had been waiting for their shepherd to return. But what seemed like healing soon unraveled into something far more dangerous. Though spiritually popular, Gregory's decision reopened ancient wounds and stirred dormant tensions. The papal court had long been entrenched in French influence. Its departure from Avignon was not only a change in geography, but a tectonic shift in power. It was not just Rome. The papacy returned to it was to a fractured institution with no clear pathway through the maze it had created for itself. When Gregory died the following year, the cardinals convened in Rome to elect his successor, pressured by the Roman populace, who demanded an Italian pope. They selected Bartolomeo Prignano, the Archbishop of Bari, who took the name Urban VI. The cardinals, who had chosen him, expected a compliant figure grateful for their support, pliable, willing to take their counsel with due reverence. But Urban had other intentions. He was not a figurehead, but a reformer with fire in his bones. Urban VI was determined to cleanse the Church of the decadence and excess that had defined the Avignon years. He preached against the luxury of the clergy, condemned the intrigues of the cardinals, and demanded austerity where they had grown accustomed to indulgence. His words, though laced with spiritual truth, were sharp and unrelenting. What might have been a golden opportunity for renewal instead deepened divisions. The very cardinals who had placed the crown upon his head now recoiled. Feeling betrayed, they fled Rome and declared Urban's election invalid, citing undue pressure from the Roman mob. They convened in Fondi and elected another Pope, Robert of Geneva, who took the name Clement VII. With this act, Christendom found itself standing before an abyss. Two men now claimed the throne of St. Peter. Each excommunicated the other. Each claimed to be the one true vicar of Christ. Each had the allegiance of powerful kings and princes across Europe, and thus began what history would remember as the Great Schism. In this division, politics loomed far larger than doctrine. France, Spain, and Scotland recognized Clement VII, whose papacy returned to Avignon. Meanwhile, England, Germany, and most of Italy stood by Urban VI, who remained in Rome. This was not a theological schism in the mold of earlier controversies over Christ's nature or the sacraments. It was a crisis of legitimacy, an institutional collapse of singular authority in a church that had, for centuries, represented the very soul of Western unity. There was no roadmap for such a fracture. Canon law, intricate and ancient, had no provision for a world in which two popes were elected under valid forms, yet stood in irreconcilable opposition. Each held councils. Each appointed bishops and issued bulls. Each condemned the other's followers to damnation. The result was chaos. Devout Christians, peasants, and princes, alike-faced, agonizing choices. Allegiance to one pope meant heresy in the eyes of the other. Churches within the same city could be aligned to opposing pontiffs. Clerics were caught between loyalties, and lay people were left adrift, their faith clouded by legalism and contradiction. Out of this mire emerged voices not of rebellion, but of reform. Theologians at the great medieval universities, Oxford, Prague, turned to reason, tradition, and scripture. Drawing upon Aristotelian political theory and canonical precedent, they argued that the Church was not the private property of a single man, but a community, a corpus mysticum, a mystical body governed by the consensus of its members. Authority, they claimed, ultimately resided not in any one pope, but in the Church as a whole, expressed through general councils. This movement came to be known as conciliarism, and it posed the most radical challenge to papal supremacy since the earliest centuries of Christianity. If the Pope could be wrong, if he could be schismatic, then the faithful needed a higher authority to resolve such crises. Councils, representing the universal Church, could declare, depose, and judge even the Pope himself. The first major attempt at resolution came in 1409, when the Council of Pisa convened. With representatives from across Europe, the council boldly declared both existing popes Benedict XIII in Avignon and Gregory XII in Rome deposed for their intransigence. In their place, they elected Alexander V, but instead of ending the schism, Pisa deepened it. Neither of the original popes accepted the council's authority. Now, there were three popes. The spectacle of triple papacy brought the office to its knees. The papacy, once the seat of sacred unity, had become the butt of satire and scorn. Poets and pamphleteers mocked the Church's impotence. Faithful Christians despaired. How could salvation flow from such confusion? Had the institutional Church forfeited its spiritual mandate? And yet, even in this nadir, a solution was slowly forming. In 1414, the Council of Constance was convened not by papal decree, but by imperial authority. For 4 years, it wrestled with the question of legitimacy. The result was as much political as spiritual. Gregory XII, the Roman Pope, agreed to resign. The Pisan Pope, John XXIII, was deposed. Benedict XIII refused to step down, but his support had so dwindled that he faded into obscurity. In their place, the council elected Martin, ending the schism and restoring singular papal leadership. But Constance did more than unify. It codified conciliar theory into law. The decree Hex Sancta declared that general councils held authority over the Pope in matters of crisis. For a fleeting moment, it seemed that a constitutional church had been born, a church governed not by the whim of one man, but by the reasoned judgment of the faithful assembled. Yet that dream, like so many in history, was short-lived. Martin V and his successors tolerated conciliarism only so far as it served their immediate needs. Once restored, the papacy moved swiftly to dismantle the very structures that had enabled its salvation. Over the following decades, the Renaissance popes rebuilt the Church not as a community of believers, but as a centralized monarchy, more opulent and more politically adept than ever before. The lessons of the schism were not forgotten, but they were buried beneath frescoes, treaties, and stone. What emerged was dazzling. The papacy of the 15th century became a cultural patron like none before. Rome transformed into a living museum where Michelangelo painted, Raphael sketched, and Bramante built. The grandeur of the Church, once spiritual, now radiated in marble and gold. But beneath this splendor lay fragility. The moral and theological authority of the papacy had never fully recovered. The Renaissance popes were admired, but not revered. The memory of schism remained, a dormant ember awaiting the breath of reform. The 14th century had begun with the Church in power, confident and unchallenged. It ended with the faithful divided, the clergy scrutinized, and reformers gathering courage. The Black Death had ravaged Europe's population, breaking apart the feudal bonds that had structured society for centuries. With so many gone, labor grew scarce. Peasants demanded higher wages and greater rights. Serfdom, once the bedrock of rural economy, began to erode. New economic relationships emerged, grounded in contracts, currency, and competition. On the battlefield, too, transformation had taken root. The 100 Years' War between England and France revealed the declining effectiveness of feudal levies. In their place rose professional armies, disciplined, permanent, and loyal not to local lords, but to kings. These armies required taxes, not oaths, and the parliaments that approved those taxes began to see themselves not as advisors, but as guardians of the realm's purse. The seeds of modern representative government were thus sown in blood and ledgers. And amidst plague, war, and schism, new voices rose in faith. The institutional Church, weakened by scandal and excess, left a void that was filled by movements emphasizing personal piety and direct communion with the divine. In the Netherlands, the Divanio Moderna called for inner devotion and humility. In Germany, the Brethren of the Common Life lived simply, teaching and praying without pretense. In England, the Lollards spread Wycliffe's belief that Scripture, not the Church, was the true authority. These were not yet revolutions, but they were tremors, deep, resonant, and growing. Philosophy, too, shifted. The grand harmonies of scholasticism, where Thomas Aquinas had reconciled faith and reason, began to falter. Nominalist thinkers like William of Ockham questioned whether human reason could truly grasp divine truth. Certainty, once the crown of medieval thought, gave way to skepticism and inquiry. The old world, the world of chivalry, of cathedral and cloister, of unquestioned order, was dissolving. In its place came new experiments in politics, economy, faith, and art. Vernacular literature flourished. Dante, Chaucer, and Christine de Puzan gave voice to new visions of humanity, identity, and society. Their words echoed not in Latin, but in the tongues of the people, laying the groundwork for future nations and cultures. By the end of the century, Europe stood on the threshold of transformation. The medieval world, with its certainties and constraints, had died not suddenly, but with a long and painful sigh. From its ruins rose new ideas, new powers, and a new world. And far to the east, in the shadow of the Bosphorus, the last echo of the ancient empire prepared for its final stand. In 1453, as massive Ottoman cannons shattered the once impenetrable Theodosian walls, Constantine XI Palaiologos, last emperor of Byzantium, donned the purple robes of Caesar and took up his sword. He died fighting, surrounded not by legions, but by memory of a Rome that had endured for over 1,000 years, and with his death, a 1,000-year-old idea crumbled into dust. Yet even as empires fell, the world was being made anew. The Roman Empire, in its final Eastern form, breathed its last breath with the fall of Constantinople. This was not just a military defeat or a dynastic collapse, marked the end of an entire world. Constantinople had stood as a living bridge between antiquity and the medieval Christian world. It had preserved the legal traditions of Rome, the philosophical and scientific insights of ancient Greece, and the Christian legacy of the early Church Fathers. For centuries, it had functioned as a beacon of civilization, while much of Western Europe wrestled with feudal fragmentation and recurring waves of crisis. The city was more than a political capital. It was an idea and enduring embodiment of Christian Rome's spiritual and imperial legacy. Its fall in 1453 to the Ottoman Turks signaled not just the end of the Byzantine Empire. With the sound of Mehmed II's massive bronze cannons battering the ancient Theodosian walls, a chapter of European history that had lasted over 1,000 years came to a dramatic close. Yet, long before Constantinople finally succumbed, Western Europe had already begun undergoing profound changes that were reshaping the very fabric of its civilization. The crises of the 14th century, famine, plague, prolonged warfare, and ecclesiastical collapse had broken the institutional framework of medieval society. The chaos of that century, instead of simply bringing about decay, had set the stage for reinvention. In the rubble of the old world, new ideas, systems, and cultural expressions began to take root. This gradual but decisive shift laid the foundations of what we now call modernity. The Renaissance, already flourishing by the mid-15th century, was not simply a return to the classics or a revival of ancient art and literature. It was a complete reimagining of the human experience. This reimagining was evident first and foremost in the way human beings thought about themselves. Medieval thinkers had typically emphasized the fallenness of humanity, the sinfulness inherited from Adam, the weakness of reason, the need for divine grace. But Renaissance humanists placed new emphasis on human dignity, creativity, and agency. The writings of Petrarch, Pico della Mirandola, and Erasmus reflect this shift in tone and worldview. Rather than accepting humanity's limitations as divinely ordained, these thinkers celebrated human potential. The Renaissance spirit was one of aspiration, of belief in the ability of individuals to shape their own destinies, not merely endure the sufferings of a fallen world. Artists, too, began to depict the world differently. In place of the symbolic, flat, and otherworldly figures of medieval painting, Renaissance art offered a stunning realism, a technical mastery that mirrored the complexity of the human form and the physical environment. The result was a new visual language that brought art closer to the natural world and to the human experience. Brunelleschi's dome over the Florence Cathedral, completed in 1436, was not just an architectural marvel. It symbolized a culture rediscovering its capacity for greatness. It invoked ancient Rome not merely as inspiration, but as precedentous proof that contemporary humans could match, or even surpass, the achievements of the ancients. This flourishing was not confined to the arts. It permeated politics, philosophy, and everyday life. In the bustling city-states of Italy, Florence, Venice, Milan, a new kind of government emerged, one that was driven by commerce rather than feudal hierarchy. These cities were governed not by hereditary nobles, but by wealthy merchant families, bankers, and guild leaders. They were dynamic, competitive, and deeply engaged with the wider Mediterranean world. The Medici family in Florence, for example, used their banking fortune to shape not only the economy, but also the culture of their city. Cosimo de' Medici's patronage of scholars, artists, and architects transformed Florence into the epicenter of European intellectual life. His establishment of the Platonic Academy signaled a major shift. Here were scholars, many of them laymen rather than clerics, who gathered to study classical texts not for theological validation, but as sources of practical and moral wisdom. This enthusiasm for antiquity was part of a broader intellectual transformation. While medieval scholasticism had focused on reconciling Christian doctrine with Aristotelian logic, Renaissance humanism prioritized the study of history, rhetoric, and classical languages. This new approach favored the empirical over the abstract, the particular over the universal. It encouraged the close reading of texts in their original languages, the pursuit of eloquence in writing and speech, and the application of ancient wisdom to modern dilemmas. The rediscovery of lost classical works, some newly unearthed, others newly translated, infused European thought with a vigor and diversity that the rigid scholastic curricula of the universities had not permitted. A technological revolution amplified these cultural shifts. The invention of the printing press. Around 1450, Johannes Gutenberg developed movable type printing in Mainz, Germany. By 1455, his press had produced the first printed Bible. This innovation transformed the production and dissemination of knowledge. What had once been the slow, laborious, and expensive task of scribes became a mechanized process, capable of producing books in the hundreds and eventually thousands. Within decades, printing presses had sprung up in virtually every major European city. They produced not just religious texts, but also classical literature, philosophical treatises, scientific manuals, and vernacular writings. The consequences of this transformation were vast. Public discourse expanded. Scholars across distant regions could now study and debate the same texts. The uniformity of printed texts created shared intellectual reference points, enabling the rise of transnational communities of thought. Perhaps most significantly, the ability to access knowledge outside ecclesiastical or aristocratic institutions began to challenge those institutions' authority, control over information. Once the preserve of the church and a few elite universities began to weaken. And yet the Renaissance was more than an intellectual or technological revolution. It was also a political and social one. Civic humanism, the belief that active participation in public life was essential to human fulfillment, challenged the medieval ideal that the contemplative life was superior. Thinkers like Leonardo Bruni and Coluccio Salutati drew on Roman Republican traditions to argue for engagement in the life of the city. Their ideas influenced not only Florence, but also other republics and monarchies throughout Europe. Kings and princes increasingly justified their rule not merely through divine right or feudal obligation, but through appeals to Roman law, to the public good, to reasoned governance. Bureaucracies, professionalized, lawyers trained in humanist principles administered the expanding states of France, Spain, and England. This intellectual and political shift coincided with and was partly driven by economic change. The old feudal order, already weakened by the Black Death and centuries of war, gave way to new patterns of production and exchange. Trade routes expanded. Banking institutions grew more sophisticated. Cities became economic as well as cultural powerhouses. Merchant capital financed not just commerce, but art, scholarship, and urban development. Wealth was increasingly generated not through land ownership, but through enterprise, commercial, financial, and industrial. This economic vitality underpinned the explosion of artistic production. The patrons of Renaissance art were not just princes and popes, but also guilds, wealthy merchants, and civic councils. The subjects of art expanded accordingly. Religious themes remained important, but artists now also depicted classical myths, secular rulers, scenes of daily life, and idealized human forms. Portraiture flourished. Human individuality became a worthy subject for artistic expression. Donatello's David, the first freestanding nude sculpture since antiquity, exemplified this new confidence in the human body and the human spirit. Botticelli's mythological scenes, with their lyrical beauty and psychological depth, blended Christian allegory with pagan imagination. This spirit of synthesis, of merging the sacred and the secular, the ancient and the modern, characterized the Renaissance at its height. It was a time of extraordinary complexity, where old certainties gave way to new questions. Where once people had looked to the church for all answers, they now turned also to ancient authors, to personal conscience, to empirical inquiry. The Renaissance did not abandon Christianity, far from it, but it transformed the way Christianity was understood, expressed, and lived. Devotion became more personal. The spiritual emphasis shifted from collective ritual to individual reflection. Lay piety movements, mysticism, and vernacular religious literature all pointed to a changing religious sensibility, one that foreshadowed the Reformation. As the 15th century drew to a close, the outlines of a new world were becoming clear. The institutions, assumptions, and identities of the medieval world had been shaken by catastrophe and crisis. But out of that turbulence emerged something unprecedented, a civilization oriented not toward the repetition of the past, but toward discovery, invention, and self-assertion. The fall of Constantinople was tragic, yes, but it did not mark an end so much as a transformation. With the Eastern Empire gone, the cultural center of gravity shifted decisively to the West. The age of transformation had begun in earnest. Europe stood poised to enter a new era, one defined by exploration, scientific inquiry, religious upheaval, and artistic glory. The old world had passed away. A new world was rising. Hope lingered in the air like a fine mist in the year 1498, when Europe stood poised at the quiet edge of a great unfolding. It was not the sort of moment that makes itself known with fanfare or thunder. Rather, it whispered soft and persistent as if carried by the scratch of a quill across vellum. the turning of gears in a dim Florentine workshop, or the rustle of parchment beneath calloused, ink-stained hands. Somewhere in that world of candlelight and chisel, a man named Leonardo da Vinci bent over his notebooks, lost in thought. His mind was filled with visions of flying machines, wooden wings flapping against the heavens, of engines wrought for defense and conquest, of cogs and pulleys pulled straight from dreams. He drew not merely to illustrate, but to imagine, to reach across the centuries toward a future not yet born. His sketches mapped a universe where man might soar like the birds, dive like fish, or build like gods. But in doing so, Leonardo was more than a solitary genius lost in abstraction. He was a mirror, a harbinger, a living metaphor for the transformation already blooming across the continent he called home. For even as his hands worked in solitude, the world around him was stirring to life with a different kind of energy, one not of muscle and fealty, but of mind, of inquiry, of ambition. Europe, for over 1,000 years, had walked a path shaped by the long memory of Rome's fall. In that distant collapse, whole orders had crumbled, empires, economies, and certainties. The centuries that followed were no mere abyss, as some have wrongly claimed, but a period of gestation. The medieval age, rich with its own beauty and horror, had built cathedrals like frozen prayers, preserved knowledge like embers beneath ash, and cultivated a world that was deeply human and deeply divine. It was an age of saints and soldiers, of hunger and song, of cloisters and crusades. But now, that age was giving way, not with the scream of ruin, but with the exhale of metamorphosis. The year 1498 was not a border, but a threshold, a quiet crossing into something new. And yet, this newness did not spring fully formed from the ground. It was shaped from the clay of what came before. The Europe, stepping into the 16th century, carried within it the genetic memory of its medieval mother. Its languages, laws, superstitions, and social hierarchies were still bound to the old rhythms, feudal oaths, ecclesiastical courts, manorial dues. But something had shifted. The scaffolding of the past remained, but the spirit inside it had begun to change. Trade, once local and cautious, had grown bold and outward-looking. Cities pulsed with energy, Venice, Bruges, Seville, London, like glowing embers flickering to life in the vast dark. Ships rode the salt winds, not merely across the Mediterranean, but out into the Atlantic, toward shores unseen by European eyes. Maps dared to imagine coastlines only rumored in tale and fable. And within these ports and palaces, minds were awakening to the possible. No longer content to inherit truth from authority alone, thinkers turned toward observation. Artists, too, looked not just to heaven, but to the human body, the curve of a shoulder, the play of light on skin, the quiet nobility of a shepherd's gaze. To those still steeped in the certainties of the earlier age, this new gaze might have seemed unsettling, even blasphemous, but it was not rebellion. It was curiosity, ancient and powerful, stirring like spring beneath frost. And yet, even as these transformations blossomed in art and inquiry, the deeper change was subtler still. It was a shift in how people saw themselves in time. For most of the medieval world, the past had been a golden age, a sacred origin. The present was trial, and the future judgment. But now, for the first time in centuries, the future began to glimmer with something else. Hope. Not merely hope of salvation, but of progress, of improvement, of change shaped by human hands. This hope was fragile, flickering, and not without danger. but it animated a new kind of thought. Universities brimmed with heated debates, not just about theology, but about physics and law. Printing presses clattered in cities where books had once been rarer than silver, and rulers, sensing the winds of change, began to dream of centralized power, of nationhood, of statecraft shaped not by divine right alone, but by bureaucracy, force, and strategy. It was a Europe still clad in chainmail, but reaching for the telescope. To Charlemagne, had he been resurrected into this world of movable type and double-entry bookkeeping, it would have been a dreamscape of marvels. He might have gazed upon the oil paintings of Raphael with awe, marveled at the ships moored along the Thames, and wondered at the idea of a book one could buy in a market stall. He would have recognized, perhaps dimly, the bones of his empire in the Holy Roman Empire, still struggling to find its form, but the spirit had changed. It was more worldly, more self-aware, more daring. To Thomas Aquinas, that great synthesizer of faith and reason, this was the flowering of seeds he himself had planted. His meticulous efforts to harmonize Aristotle with Christianity had laid foundations for rational inquiry. But even he might have blinked at how far things had moved. The questioning had not stopped, it had accelerated. His scholastic heirs no longer confined themselves to questions of grace and being, but asked how planets moved, why blood flows, how society ought to govern itself. And to the chroniclers, those silent monks who had inked the deeds of kings and saints by candlelight, the age, now dawning, might have seemed disorienting, even frightening. The world they recorded had been one of moral clarity, of divine order, of war waged for heaven and repentance, won through pain. In the new world, such certainties were dissolving. The printing press replaced the monastery scriptorium. The merchant eclipsed the knight, and the painter, not the preacher, now shaped the image of the divine. It was an unsettling beauty, but the change, though disquieting to some, was not destruction. It was continuity transformed. The medieval world was not cast aside, it was transmuted, its institutions reshaped, its values re-examined, its myths reinterpreted. The cloisters of Europe did not fall silent, nor did the cathedrals crumble. But beside them now rose universities, banks, observatories, and workshops. Men still prayed, but they also measured. They still believed, but they now questioned. They still feared sin, but they also sought understanding. From the soaring vaults of Gothic cathedrals to the precise geometry of Renaissance domes, the spirit of Europe was shifting from vertical to horizontal, from heavenward, longing to worldly presence, and in that transformation, new vistas opened. Political theory began to explore not just the rights of kings, but the rights of men. Commerce expanded beyond the fair to encompass entire continents, and art, once bound to liturgical cycles, now told the stories of lovers, peasants, and princes. Leonardo's flying machines drawn in solitude symbolized this broader ascent. He would never see them fly, but his vision, his refusal to be constrained by what was encapsulated, the quiet revolution of his time. Europe, too, was learning to dream beyond its reach. The late 15th century was thus both an end and a beginning. It marked the quiet closing of a chapter 1,000 years long, a story written in crusades and councils, in plagues and pilgrimages, in parchment and psalm. That chapter was not one of stagnation, but of gestation. And now, with the ink barely dry, the next volume was ready to begin. This next volume would tell of empires built and broken, of revolutions and constitutions, of telescopes turned skyward and microscopes turned inward. It would be the story of science and skepticism, of industry and ideology, of colonialism, capitalism, and the long, uneven march toward what we call the modern world. But it would be built, stone upon stone, from what came before. For even as the Renaissance bloomed, it drew its breath from medieval roots. Even as modernity beckoned, it did so with echoes of the past. The modern mind did not emerge from a vacuum, it emerged from the monastery, the battlefield, the market, the forge, from the plough and the psalter, from loss and learning. And so, as the last breath of the medieval world settled into the annals of time, there was no grand collapse, no curtain fell. Instead, there was transformations, slow, patient, powerful. The 1,000-year story of medieval Europe was complete, not buried, but fulfilled. And the modern world, restless, ambitious, and uncertain, was about to begin.